Chapter 63, Resonance Break Eye. A flash of brilliant light accompanied by the crack of impact. Stella's four jagged, golden teeth broke into the monstrosity's heavily armored chest. All the spikes of carapace protruding from the area shattered and flew apart from the impact. But Furio knew something was off from the moment the flail had hit. He was experienced enough to tell from the simple feel of the blow that it was too shallow, the sound of the strike strong but still far duller than it should have been. No minus. Furio's gray eyes widened as he saw a thick circle of red encasing the monster's chest, directly covering its heart. It had used the martial art guard, condensing the mana it circulated throughout its body with Uxel into that single point in a mere instant. A transition like that from free flow to sudden concentration required years and years of practice, and even then, you would be hard-pressed to find anybody except from the upper star adventurers who could make transitions as quickly as that. But at the very least, the monster was still injured. Stella generated power with its activation and rotations, and by now, it was easily strong enough to smash through the monster's carapace with sheer physical power alone. The white plating had cracked and split apart at the heart, even beneath the dense layer of protective mana and the purple personal sapien shielding. Bright red, raw pectoral muscles lined with streaks of white lay underneath, bleeding from force that tore a few of those powerful strands of muscles apart. Furio waited for a moment. Stella's light had touched that open wound. If all went well, then the creature's own longevity and primal density would work against it, and the flesh would start to bubble up, rupture, and blow apart. But no such thing happened. "I see," said the monster instead, observing as some of its raw, exposed flesh shuddered before a few blood vessels popped and muscle fibers tore further. But nothing close to a major wound. Then, its eyes settled on Stella, the flail head already moving back to Furio, but slower this time, having lost much momentum because of his surprise. Furio yanked back on his wrench, pulling Stella back faster. Too late. The monster immediately learned. Both its arms flashed purple, and instead of trying to put a force hold on Stella itself, it instead willed up a mound of dirt from the ground. The dirt hit the chain with an impact that forced Stella to stop flying back and angle sharply downwards, slamming into the ground and blasting out a crater of dirt as several insects nearby blew apart from its light. Furio adjusted as well, swiveling his wrench to the side to free the flail head, but the monster was already upon it. With a single swipe, it severed the flail head from its supporting golden chains, and in another instant, Furio saw Stella, crafted personally by his great master, a core-forged weapon of a rarity that almost nobody in his star rank could match, disappear into the monster's mouth. The shining light of Stella faded in an instant as the monster swallowed the flail head. "This is quite nourishing. Unlike anything I have sampled before minus," said the monster. It paused as if to speak again, but then light shone strongly from within its stomach, lighting up its insides through its flesh and carapace and revealing the silhouette of 3 different hearts. Was Stella's light still working? Destroying the monster from within? No, Furio could tell that the light was dimming by the moment. The creature was frozen only in digesting the mass amount of power stored within Stella. Instinctively, Furio knew that this monster had to be stopped here. No matter what. It did not have primal density yet, but it would gain more and more as time passed. At a certain point, no sorcerer would be able to deal with it using God-given magics. It grew stronger from everything it consumed. At a certain point, no adventurer would be able to deal with it. The gods themselves would fall before it if it was not stopped now. Furio had gone through 56 successful hunts in his life as an adventurer, many of those of a threat ranking beyond what he was supposed to deal with. But he knew that every single one of those hunts, every single struggle he faced and overcame, was to make him stronger for this very moment. To kill this monster before it killed everything else. Furio tore Stella's chain off from his wrench and slotted in Yolgu. The square blade vibrated faintly, still having enough stored power for 2 more activations. Kill the monster before it could move again. Furio roared as green lit up his body in a strong Uxel, empowering him as he leapt forwards with Yolgu raised overhead. There were vital points every adventurer knew to strike. The brain, if a monster had one, and then its cores. This monster possessed 3 hearts. 3 cores. Destroying any single one would not immediately defeat it. Striking the head was best. With Yolgu, Furio would smash the monstrosity's head and channel shockwaves internally, bursting the rest of the hearts. The shockwaves directly countered any form of armor plating, scales, or carapace, resonating off the hard surfaces and back through the body. Furio batted down at the monster's head. Igalgu's scales opened up and shimmered as the length of the blade crashed into the helmeted head with an explosive impact. The initial blow itself was strong enough to put in deep cracks lining the monster's head, but not enough to punch through by itself to the brain. The shockwaves, though, they traveled in mass amounts throughout the creature, shaking its enormous bulk in rapid vibrations. The carapace began to crack, and the claws on its body, seemingly far more brittle than its shell, all shattered. Soon enough, the creature would break apart completely with its insides boiled from the energy of shockwaves echoing within. Furio saw the monster inexplicably move even with shockwaves rattling it, its brawny arm reaching out and grabbing one of his arms. The enormous hand wrapped around the whole length of his forearm, and he knew what was going to happen. Furio let go of his wrench and kicked it behind him as he felt the monster rip his arm straight from the socket. The monster reached out again, this time to grab his torso, but he tethered himself to his wrench, pulling himself quickly out of range. Just like how he could push and pull his swords around his wrench, he too could act as a conduit point for it, though he was the only living, non-metallic body that this worked on. As Furio flew in the air, he saw the monster take his arm and devour it in one gulp. He grit his teeth and willed mana to condense around his empty arm socket. The muscles around the area, aided with the flow of mana, swelled up and tightened, fusing almost together to stop the mass bleeding. Furio could not understand how the creature managed to weather through Igalgu's tremors, but soon found the answer. He saw the earth under the monster splitting apart, quaking as the shockwaves transferred from its body to the ground as an aura of red circulated around it. Dispersal, an advanced martial arts technique. But how did the creature know how to use this? All it had done was seen Furio use it once. Was that truly all it needed to replicate something Furio had needed the entire summation of his years of training, talent, and breaking his own limits to muster up? I see, said the monster as it clicked its mandibles. In manipulating the flow of your mana throughout your body such that it matches the physical properties of the shockwaves traveling through them, you are able to guide them out of your body. In this manner, you may even be able to circulate electric currents harmlessly. Your device that is capable of generating such electricity thus is also rendered useless against me. But no matter. I now understand that these tools of yours are fashioned from the essence of physical specimen. They will now be mine. You have proven your worth adequately. It is now time to be consumed. Furio hung onto his wrench in the air, suspended in tethered orbit as it was with the two swords near it. He thought about giving up. But he was far too deep into this fight to do that. And it was not just Emmy and Vera, the fate of all common life rested upon his shoulders. And he still had one ace up his sleeve. For now, he needed to make distance. Igalgu was slotted into it and Fulmi orbited it. But like the beast had said, Fulmi was useless against it now if it had mastered dispersal to the extent that it could minimize damage from Igalgu. Furio tapped Fulmi with the wrench, imparting a magnetic push on it that sent it flying 50 meters away, the maximum range of the tether. He then raised an index finger to tap his wrench, making it pull towards Fulmi. Like this, he could semi-replicate the effects of flying, and though it was fast, the flight patterns were predictable, following his magnetic tethers that all had linear paths. No doubt, the monster would pick up on this. But all he needed to do was get out of this forest, out of any potential interference getting in the way between himself and this monster when he used the most powerful ability in his entire arsenal, one utterly unique to him and his Ethera, the Resonance Break. Chapter 64, Resonance Break 2. Furio braced himself for impact as he flew upwards and smashed through the darkwood trees, his trained, superhuman muscles and the mana encasing them allowing him to break through branches and bugs. In the next moment, he was out in the open air, above the tree line. Furio stopped flying when his wrench neared Fulmi, around 20 meters above the treetops. He knew this was not going to be enough, and his suspicions were confirmed when he heard the shadowy leaves under him rustle. With a practiced series of motions, Furio tapped Fulmi with his wrench again, bidding it to fly backwards, out into the clearing where there were no trees, no large, sturdy bodies to interfere with the resonance break. Then, he used his index finger to tap the wrench while gripping it, sending him flying towards Fulmi. Right in the nick of time. The monster's enormous form smashed through the trees, huge, enormous demonic wings unfurled to its sides, the wingspan of clawed, bat-like wings almost as large as the monstrosity itself. With a gust of wind blowing behind it, the monster just barely missed swiping at Furio as he flew backwards. Furio knew that in terms of speed, this makeshift flight could match or even exceed the creature's own flight speed. After all, he shot his blades out like bullets, and when he pulled himself to them, he was treated as a projectile and became just as fast. A half-second later, Furio stopped abruptly again by Fulmi, 50 meters away. Furio gritted his teeth as he condensed mana into his body. The sudden stop from bullet-like velocity to a standstill would have probably killed the ordinary man with whiplash, but he had trained his body to deal with this. He glanced down, open, grassy ground. Swarms of insects, yes, but they were weak enough that they did not matter if they got caught in the resonance break. The darkwood trees, though, were a different matter. His eyes widened. The beast was already upon him, its enormous, plated fist drawn back and ready to smash his head clean off. Furio reacted by grabbing the wrench and having it treat himself like a projectile, shooting himself straight down into the ground. As a blur of movement, he flew right down, smashing into the ground with an impact that shattered the earth beneath his mana-infused legs and boots. Small insects around the landing zone flew up and broke apart from the force. This monster was an adept flyer and easily in control of its body to such a degree that it could compensate for Furio's faster flight speed by predicting his linear movement patterns and moving before he did. Furio knew the monster would be upon him again in the next moment. He gripped his wrench and tapped it with a finger, calling back Flam from all the way back in the forest. Powering even more mana into his legs, he used dash and shifted 5 or so meters backwards in an instant, burning up grass and skidding across dirt with the high-speed movement. The monster slammed into where Furio had been like a red and purple line meteorite, blasting apart a crater twice the size Furio had made. Even the larger insects broke apart with the shockwave of force, their body parts and legs and shells all flying in the guts and debris-littered air. The monster adjusted its sight to Furio, specifically at his legs, and he knew he had to make this work soon. If the beast could learn advanced martial arts techniques with just 1 or 2 demonstrations, it would know how to dash very soon. But Flam was already here, the flaming, superheated blade ready to slice into the monster's back while it was distracted by Furio. In conjunction with this, Furio tapped Idapu with his wrench, and the sickle sword shot out while lined with winds that sharpened its edge. A 2-pronged attack. But without even turning around, the monster swiveled to the side at the very last moment before the blades pierced its heart, dodging both blades completely. In the very same motion, before Flam or Idapu could return to Furio, the monster had grabbed the blades by the handles with 3 of its fingers on either hand. The monster cracked open its toothy maw and swallowed the blades whole. It oddly reminded Furio of when he walked the streets of the nearest town, Dwarka. It was, where he had seen street performers called dervishes do tricks like swallowing blades and breathing flame. And all of those streets full of performers and laughing children would be soaked in blood if Furio did not act now. He knew that the monster might spend some time digesting the core-forged blade, and so he took this moment to aim his wrench at the beast's center. Furio activated Yolgu again, its earthen scales rattling along each other and drumming up vibrations once more, and shot it out to the monster's side, missing it so that it could not grab the blade. The rattling sword shot straight into the thick of the forest, lost. This left Furio only with Fulmi, a dagger not meant for close combat whose activation was useless because the monster could use dispersal to vent out the lightning. But all of this was according to Furio's plans. He could not have the monster grabbing Yolgu. That blade had to be behind it. "I have miscalculated the degree of your injuries if your aim is degraded to this degree," said the monster as it slithered towards Furio, slower this time, almost savoring his last moments. "Let me sense." An erratic heartbeat, severe subconjunctival hemorrhaging that dyes your eyes red, and minor inefficiencies in movement indicative of no less than 22 minor fractures and extensive tearing in almost all major muscles bodies. The beast clicked its mandibles, its 6 eyes staring down at Furio's panting, armless, bloody, and broken body. "Yet, you have mustered up a battle that has done well in smoothing over your grave insult of deeming me a mere familiar. I shall grant you consideration within the collective. Consider it a great honor, degenerated human." Furio felt his body grow heavy. So very heavy as the last dregs of his mana faded from his soul. The beast talking about his injuries made him feel them even more, and he knew that once his mana completely faded, he would stop moving entirely, maybe even just die when the adrenaline also abandoned him. He still had enough strength for this, though. Thank the gods it did not cost any mana. He held the wrench out towards the monster with a trembling arm. "Bringing back the blade you ejected," said the monster. Such a primitive strategy did not amount to anything when you attempted it with the heat-generating blade. Yet, you minus. A white light flashed from the wrench head. Sudden cracks lined the entire length of the wrench as a sound like shattering bone echoed through the air. Furio smiled, his teeth dyed red in his blood. This was a nigh instantaneous attack. Using the magnetic tether the wrench had with his 5 weapons, Furio could activate resonance break, destroying both the wrench and a magical weapon to channel extremely destructive force through the tether linking the two. A last-ditch attack as it sacrificed Furio's Ethera, and that would take 3 days or more to recover. But days did not matter here. It was just this moment that mattered. A beam of white light shot out from the head of the wrench with a metallic ring as it began disintegrating, and so too would a beam have shot out from Yulgu far away. Both beams sped towards each other, and in between, the monster would break apart. No, whispered Furio under his breath. Somehow, the monster had sensed something wrong at the very last moment and had used dash to push itself into the air. Furio watched as the beam of light screamed with constantly fluxing metallic rings in front of him, missing his target entirely. But then he saw a portal. A small, circular, rainbow-lined portal in the center of the raging beam. Then, in the next second, another portal emerged above the monster and angled down towards its heart. The beam shot out from that portal. The moment the monster saw the portal, it must have understood what was to happen, and it twisted its body. The beam struck true, but instead of blowing apart its heart, it instead smashed through its left side. The carapace cracked and bent as the beam struck, but not enough. Furio screamed as he saw the attack work. He willed the beam with as much power as he could, and his wrench shattered and disintegrated entirely in an instant, a final, powerful burst of light blasting apart through the monster's entire carapace layer and then shooting straight through the enormous, armored body, reconnecting with Yulgu in the forest for half a second more before the magical weapon disintegrated with the wrench. The light faded, leaving the dark woods and night to blanket the scene in shadow once more. The monster fell to the ground with a heavy crash, kicking up a cloud of dirt around it. Furio fell to his knees, completely spent, his entire body on the verge of just breaking apart. Where had the portal come from? What he knew what it was, but no, she had left, he knew it. Vera's form materialized beside Furio, holding him. No, whispered Furio. He coughed but still managed to get his words out. No. You have to leave. Even if we missed that beast's heart, a wound that size punching right through it will have it bleeding out or crippled, said Vera. She grimaced as she saw Furio's missing arm, and she knelt down and slung his remaining arm over her shoulder, supporting him. No. Why? Said Furio. His vision blurred as his mana faded, and the blood loss hit him, delirium starting to tug at the edges of his mind. Why did you come back? I never really left, my love, said Vera. I used the short portal to move away, but I was not going to truly run and abandon you. I stayed in the area, at the edge of the battle, and I used mirror sight to track you. When I saw what you were going for near the end, I knew I could help you without holding you back, so I came here. Now, my love, just wait. I would want nothing more than to take you away from here this very moment with a short portal, but you are too injured to be on your own. Just a little while, my love, hold on for a little bit, take deep breaths, try to flow your mana evenly and stop the bleeding, and then I can long portal you to the safe zone. Vera stopped as she heard clicking from behind her. A distinctive clicking unlike that of the insects around them. No, the insects had fled, leaving them alone in a patch of empty dirt and grass, for they had sensed it before she had. The monster was still alive. An injury of this caliber minus. Vera turned to meet the voice. A squall of wind rushed up from where the monster had landed, its raging red aura flickering high above it, lighting the area blood red, and where that chaotic light stretched, every single insect fled, sensing the wrath of a higher predator. Is the gravest I have borne upon this primitive rock so far, said the monstrosity as he stared at Vera and Furio. An empty hole the size of a human head sizzled from its left chest, blood pooling liberally from it, but the monster did not fall. Was it like this? That emergency medical procedure the male specimen utilized to stem hemorrhaging from your arm. The monster raised a hand to its eyes, as if analyzing it, and then shaped its red aura into the hand, swirling it, condensing it, and then slammed its palm into the hole gaping from its chest. Yes, this was precisely it, said the monster. It uncovered its hand. What? Stammered Vera. Muscle began to swell and surge from the wound, stemming all bleeding and fusing the hole shut. But an incomplete procedure. Now to compensate for the loss of blood vessels and critical bone structures, continued the monster. The aura raging red around its body turned purple. Gleaming purple outlines started to streak around the mass of muscle sealing the wound, forming into the shapes of veins and parts of ribs that must have been lost from the blow. Utilizing sepia to create artificial internal body structures. The cost, a continual loss of mana. Yet, worthy of removing compromised combat capacity due to injury, noted the monstrosity. Out, said Furio. He pushed himself off from Vera, standing in front of her shakily. He had no weapons anymore. Only Fulmi, and that did not even work. He had no energy to shout now as he trudged towards the monster's towering form. Short portal yourself out again. Run this time. Run like you mean it. This thing grows stronger every time it eats. Soon, nobody will beat it. Tell the adventurers leak. Go. Furio's eyes widened as he felt something jab into his back. He turned to see Vera had stabbed him with a dwarven syringe. The green liquid within it drained into him, and he felt temporary mana flow throughout his body. This. Maybe I can stall for 30 seconds. Enough time for you. Go, said Furio. Yes, this was enough for her to escape if she short-portaled herself out right now and used even shorter-range teleportations like Blink as often as possible. That wasn't for me, said Vera. Furio felt her hands on his bare, bleeding back. They were soft. Warm. He felt her lips on his neck, and as the monster moved before he could even look back at her again, she had short-portaled him out. To the thick of the darkwoods. 200 meters away from the battle. The maximum range for an instantaneous short portal. No. 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 Furio started to turn back to the clearing. If he used enough of the temporary booster mana, he could get back there in time, he could. He shook his head, blood-tinged tears welling up from his eyes. No, she had wanted him to run with this last spurt of power. It was the hardest decision of his life, and in a second that felt like it lasted an eternity, he decided to turn around. And run. Chapter 65. Bone Binding. The collector clicked its mandibles in rising irritation exacerbated by its unbound emotion and the trigger of desire. Or to be more specific, desire unfulfilled. It looked down at the human female specimen craning her neck up at it, taking a shaky step back. Pitiful. The stench of fear, a scent that evoked the strongest sense of detest possible from the collector, reeked from her. Not at all like the male specimen who emanated only the scent and pressure of the fight. The collector had allowed the specimen to show his worth, and he provided ample challenge to exercise the collector's desire for battle, not to mention the acquisition of several new valuable genetic material specimen from his weapons. But above all, the collector had desired the male specimen's core to devour him wholly as a means of honoring his willingness to stand and fight through a battered body and the oppressive knowledge of facing a superior enemy. Now, however, this female specimen had doomed the worthier male to the ignoble fate of fleeing like prey. The collector sensed the female specimen move, and with a quick flick of her wrist, withdrew a shard of red crystal from a small ripple in space, tossing it at the collector. Before it struck the collector, the crystal exploded into a swirling pillar of fire. The collector did take damage from this attack, though it was highly minimized due to its sapien shielding. Mana level, 400-390%. Sapien abilities were heavily taxing in their mana usage. This included the makeshift bones and blood flow the collector simulated in its injury. That alone would cost approximately 5% of its total mana every single minute. But devouring the male specimen's weapons, so immensely rich with mana as they were, had overloaded the collector by converting their excess spirit roots into pure energy. This energy, the collector's current form could not stabilize for long, and it deteriorated by the minute. Yet, while it was active, the collector's combat capability would rise by 170%. The collector possessed great power in the moment, but it was on a timer, and within this timer, it could no longer afford to revel in another battle for its desire. It had to finish its mission. Yet, it did desire something from this female. I will hold you back, began the female human as she stepped back again, moving to withdraw something more. The collector disappeared in a burst of crackling red as it pumped mana into its tail and used dash. It stopped when its fist had torn right through the female's chest, her heart still beating in its enormous hand. The female's eyes widened as she coughed up a spurt of blood. Then, she grew still. Limp. Dead. The collector held that heart gently, taking care not to crush it. It withdrew its arm from her body with the slick sound of blood and organs squelching against its carapace. The corpse fell forwards, a growing pattern of blood forming in the ground around her. The collector beheld the heart, this core, seeing rainbow-colored mana infused within it. This female specimen had certainly vexed the collector with her capacity to interface with some degree of hyperspace. From the color and appearance of circuitry whenever she utilized magic, it would appear that this hyperspace accessibility was regulated by a god of some kind. In other words, the collector would not utilize it through ordinary consumption, for that would mean not only bowing to a deity, but also to allow access within itself to some foreign presence. A risk it would not take. But this ability truly was useful, and the collector channeled the thrall's trigger for greed, amplifying its desire. Flashes of blue permeated the collector's red aura, and it prepared itself to utilize bone binding. To be sure, the collector had utilized bone binding before in the fight with the human male, but only within its own bones. The thrall could channel power from its bones to turn itself into mist, but the collector was different. Channeling power through its bones only created more power. Raw, destructive power in the form of shockwaves that accentuated its physical movements or, if analyzed further and focused, allowed the collector more ranged combat capabilities in the form of generating pulverizing, pressurized air through its punches. Bone binding something else was different. More difficult. Would require the entirety of the specimen's skeletal structure intact as well as the core itself. Involved taking all the roots from within the flesh and bones, infusing them into the core, and then infusing the core into a leftover bone. The process would take several hours. The thrall itself with its horrendously undeveloped brain must have spent entire days working on a single bone-binding operation. The collector did not have that time. But if its calculations were correct, then it would have assistance. I'm back," came the female daemon's voice as she hovered to the collector. The heat-generating blade had pierced through her shoulder, disabling it nearly entirely, but the wound had cauterized, minimizing the chances for infection. And, as the collector noted from her movements as she floated to its side, her exceptional pain tolerance rendered her almost fully functional. Good. Her functionality was needed, as was her superb magical sensitivity that rivaled even that of the collector's, even exceeding it had she been undamaged. You're injured," said the demon as she stared at the muscle and sapia constructs covering the hole in the collector's chest. "But you've managed to seal a wound like this so easily and using sapia like this. I've never seen the like of it, didn't think it would be possible." She cocked her head, nodding to herself. "But now that I see it, it seems reasonable. Simple. I see now." Herthel reached to the collector, and when the spike touched the thin layer of sapien shielding around the collector, their psionic auras merged again in a tether. Through this, the demon closed her eyes, taking care of the cost of creating and circulating the sapia construct bones and blood vessels. The collector clicked its mandibles. This would minimize continual mana loss. And with this specimen to assist it, the time to complete this bone-binding procedure also drastically reduced. Estimated time of completion, provided the female specimen was as effective as calculated, 10 minutes. "I require your assistance," said the collector. "Why yes," said the demon as she perked up, wanting to be useful. The collector knelt down by the female human's corpse, holding the heart over her. The female demon stared at the mangled corpse without a shred of pity in her eyes, just a sense of curiosity. "First, I shall remove any potential interference." The collector sensed insects swarming around it, and though they still feared the collector, if its mana diverted into something other than a display of power, the lowly insectoids might well have attempted to interfere. The collector opened its maw and activated its pyrocatalytic glands, sending out a torrent of white-blue flame that turned any insect it touched into ashes within a second. Rotating its head, the collector created a ring of flame far enough away from itself to grant it time for this procedure. "I will engage in a procedure meant to circulate the spirit roots imbued within this specimen's flesh and bones into this core," said the collector. "Once the core has compacted the roots within itself and stabilized, I will then once more compact the core into a bone, imbuing the osseous matter with the condensed core and roots." Wow. It's like something I've read about. A twin forge procedure, except instead of using monster roots and cores, you're using a human's, nodded the demon girl in understanding. I have some knowledge in doing something like this. Thorian, my old teacher, he knew how to core forge a little, and he taught me the basics, and this sounds just like it. She cocked her head and put a hand to her chin and thought. But But we need something that can touch the roots. Tear them from the flesh. Something spiritual. In a forge, that would be a soul shear, but minus, she looked around. We don't have one. The collector clicked its mandibles. It took its free hand and focused, channeling the thrall's bone-binding powers. Thin lines of blue wrapped around its fingers before spooling out from the fingertips in threads with hooked tips. I sense these are close approximations to this tool you classify as a soul shear, said the collector. Oh, said the demon in wonder. I had never seen bone-binding shears. They say that northern goblins had this power passed on to them from face stealers, monsters of legend. Another specimen that seems interesting to consume. Yet, a species that too will assimilate into the collective when it dawns. The collector clicked its mandibles. I sense you are familiar with this procedure to great degree. You will assist me in removing the roots from this deceased specimen's flesh. The demon female nodded, using sapia to move the 5 bone-binding shears on the collector hand. I will now open this core manually and prepare it to receive an influx of roots. As I do this, you will place the roots within. The collector ever so slightly dug its fingertips into the heart, sending the soul shears within, willing them to move through the cardiovascular organ. Blue light shone from within the heart, coloring the red a pale, icy shade as the flesh and blood organ started to grow pale and freeze over, preserving it. The demon acted with precision. She hovered a hand over the body, and the 5 soul shears on the collector's other hand fell into the body. There was no physical sign of entry as the hooked threads sank into the skin. The threads instead phased through, and when they came back out, smaller bundles of threads, some colored green, some a faint shade of rainbow, emerged attached to the hooked ends of the blue threads. Where the threads emerged, the flesh grew pale, cold, and shriveled, as if it had been frozen away for years. These threads, the demon willed up into the frozen heart, entwining them in an ever-growing ball of wound-up spirit roots. I see, said the collector. You are not targeting single roots, but areas where they intersect greatest, allowing you to withdraw dozens of threads at once. I've got the hang on this, yes, said the demon. She bit her lip in nervousness. But this will take some time. Maybe an hour. You do not do well to underestimate my processing capabilities. The rate of your removal in this procedure is notable. Yet, can be greatly assisted. The collector sprouted its 6 Araka arms from its back, and 6 ghostly blue shears unspooled from their tips. The collector could faintly sense the daemon's intent, where she wanted to enter and pick at, and knowing this, it assisted her, the 6 spider legs on its back rushing in and out of the corpse at breakneck pace. In the end, the collector and the demon finished the entire procedure in a time span just shy of 5 minutes. Chapter 66, Final Destination. The collector gazed upon the heart in its hand. It had grown so pale that it had become a purplish shade of white, and it felt cold and stiff to the touch, almost brittle. Visible through the icy flesh was a ball of glowing green and rainbow light, the summation of all the spirit roots wound up and condensed within. It is now time to transfer this into a suitable osseous vessel. The thrall utilized a skull, and I sense that it is most apt in being able to contain the most data. The collector looked down at the human female's corpse. With all the roots and core from it retrieved, the corpse had almost completely shriveled up, as if desiccated from centuries of frozen storage. The skin had withered down into pale wrinkles that barely clung onto the bones, leaving the clothes surrounding them to be baggy and oversized. There were no facial features distinguishable anymore, and the specimen's hair had decayed away into nothingness. A quick analysis of her clothes indicated nothing of note worth to consume nor material for its metalloglottic ossifier. It looked at the patch with 3 gold stars stitched on it. So this was a 3-starred adventurer. The collector had far evolved past her means. Her tricks, the trinkets she stored away and withdrew as weapons, they certainly would have dealt grievous wounds to the collector in its prior metamorphosis levels. And now, a 4-star adventurer proved to be nothing but a minor challenge. If the entire group of adventurers had faced the collector head-on, even somehow gotten a surprise advantage on it, then the collector calculated that they potentially possessed a 58% chance of defeating it. But in picking them off one by one, the collector had assured its victory, even granting it margins of error to toy with the 4-star adventurer a little, drawing out perspective for his strength. And with this information, the collector understood. The collector was beginning to outpace the strength of these mortals faster than their tiering system could keep up with it. Good. It seemed that each successive star rank indicated nearly exponentially greater strength between them. However, with the assistance of magic, the collector's growth too would only become more varied and more pronounced. It clicked its mandibles in consideration of the heights of strength it could achieve until it dampened these emotions in understanding that if it was successful in letting the collective dawn upon this world, none of that would matter. Then what was the point of this? The collector stared at the heart in its hand. It knew from the beginning that this procedure meant nothing if the collective successfully dawned, and taking this female specimen's magic would not aid the collector in direct combat. For bone binding was highly limited. Even if the collector compacted the entirety of the female's essence into a bone such as the skull, it would only allow it to manifest a single ability, a single spell, and it had determined the capacity to interface with a hyperspace storage was the most efficient and practical in the long run. But what if there was no long run? No, the collector had to create contingencies. As it had always done. As it would continue to do until its mission was completed. That it could even think like this, with what it perceived as something beginning to resemble doubt, was sickening. The collector cupped the female corpse's dried head and popped it from her spine. Utilizing sapia, it tore the flesh from the skull, and there was no resistance to the collector's manipulations anymore now that there were no roots nor life within the body. Now you will assist me in transferring the roots into the structure of this skull, said the collector. I'm sorry, began the female demon. The collector clicked its mandibles as it sensed the demon fall down to the ground, onto her knees, and began to dry heave, her breathing deep and her eyes wide in panic. I sense signs of great mental distress through this psionic tether between us, and with it, the accompaniment of physiological distress, said the collector. This is compromising your functions. I know, said the demon. She glanced at the corpse in short glimpses before she turned away, wincing. At first, I was just so curious, so happy to see new things like soul shears and bone binding, but when I started to go into the body and pick at it and pull things from it, it just hit me. Memories. All of it's so very much like what they did to me. The shining man. With the shiny strings, pick at my skin and peel it, take chunks from me, then put everything back together. Your mental and physiological signs of distress are only growing more severe. Yet, I have analyzed the nature of this tether between us. I will now mitigate these signs of distress, said the collector. The demon widened her eyes, not in panic, but in surprise. She breathed in easier. You shared a feeling with me. This feeling. It's calm. The kind of calm you always have. I have merely allowed you to sense in some small measure the mental state of the collective unbound by excess emotion. This, you perceive as calm. I sense that with this treatment, your mental state has returned to stable functioning. Now, assist me in this procedure, said the collector, bringing the skull closer to the demon. So that is what the collective is like, said the demon with a wondering nod. She looked at the skull with determination. Okay, let's do it. A few minutes later, and the collector stared down at the skull. The curves and outline of its structure flashed with a faint rainbow light. The second forging process was quite similar to the first one. The core, the heart, essentially acted as a preserving space where the roots could be gathered for in normal circumstances, the roots would expire with the corpse. But by freezing the heart into a magical stasis, the roots too could be preserved. Inside the heart, the roots would also absorb the essence of the core. Then, the collector and demon had unspooled the wound-up root threads and lined them across the structure of the skull, imbuing the bone with both the roots and the core. However, because roots and cores reacted flexibly only with living stimuli and because the bone was no living matter, the skull could store only but a few spells, a smattering of snapshots of magic frozen within the skull. In this way, spells were stored within the bone, and the bone was what casted and brought forth the magic at little to no cost to the collector. First, however, the collector had to now ascertain whether it was safe to utilize the magic imbued in this skull. Certainly, from the thrall, it seemed there were no risks to it, for it utilized magic stolen from tinkerers with no discernible risk to itself. Yet, this was different, for it involved warp-based capabilities. It was possible that whatever hyperspace this skull linked to was under another entity's dominion, some god, and that would prove troublesome. The collector used its psionic sensitive capabilities to sense the nature of the warp-based power inherent within the skull. For psionic power and warp capability were intrinsically linked together, A fact that allowed the collective hive mind with its enormous psionic processing power harvested from countless life forms to generate its own large-scale warp gates. It saw and felt psionic threads wriggling from the skull, anchored constantly to a hyperspace, and in analyzing that space, it clicked its mandibles in understanding. This form of hyperspace was essentially a limited space dedicated to single individuals. In this case, the female specimen, and now, the collector if it so desired. Trinkets and tools left by the female specimen still remained here. Further analysis of this space. Sweeping scan for any psionic tethers to other hyperspaces or entities. None. And the warp sensing that the collective imbued within the collector, even in its limited processing power, was extensive. More than extensive enough to give the collector confidence that the hyperspace this skull linked to was its distinct, separate space. This kind of space for storage which would be useful in preserving certain biological and mineral specimens. The collector clicked its mandibles. Its thought process and warp sensing had taken up the span of merely a few seconds. The ring of flames it had generated before to ward away insects flickered closer, their heat palpable now. Just in time. The collector took the skull and devoured it, assimilating it into its metalloglottic ossifier where, in its next adaptation, it could manifest the bound bone into its own biological structure to have a constantly available, regenerative source of hyperspace storage. New metalloglottic ossifier sample obtained. Minus lightstone. Minus runewood. Minus bone-binding skull. The collector turned its head down to the demon girl who looked up at him with wondering eyes, looking forward to what the next thing they would do would be an almost childish expectation. I will now enter this dungeon. Continue your assistance in maintaining the integrity of the temporary sapient structures I have erected to support my wound. The collector unfurled its demon wings. You will be able to sense my intent in combat. You are primarily to support my own usages of sapia. If your mind is capable of keeping up with the rest of my combat processing, then exercise judgment in assisting me, though if there is the slightest shred of doubt that you will hinder me, do not act at all. I got it, said the demon, nodding to herself and the collector. I won't disappoint you. Disappoint is an emotion I have sensed only in dealing with tinkerers and challengers that had the potential to rise against me and yet failed or fled. I will not feel disappointment in your failings, merely an adjustment of calculations to compensate, said the collector. It clicked its mandibles and beat down with its wings while pushing with magic-infused power with its tail, soaring high into the air. Like this, it would avoid the sea of inferior insectoid specimen below from blocking its path. In the air, the collector could perceive the dungeon in the distance. A circular pit emanating with a faint blue glow, the only strong glow remaining now in the dark woods, and began its flight to its next and potentially final destination. Chapter 67, Rolling Stone. The collector batted its wings and tucked in its arms and aracca legs, becoming an aerodynamic, serpentine missile of carapace and flesh as it rode the winds it shot out behind it. The carapace on its face slotted over in one smooth layer reminiscent of a pilot's helmet, and its purple and yellow eyes shone brightly as they homed in on the ever-nearing dungeon entrance. No discernible form of defensive force around the pit itself, merely a throng of insectoids that provided no challenge to the collector. No defensive fortifications either that barred entry. Yet, as the collector hovered over the dungeon with sapient force, it sensed the invisible psionic threads of manipulated space around the dungeon. The pit itself was shaped almost like a maw, lined with teeth comprised of mundane stone protruding from its circumference, while within the pit, the blue light glowing within formed an even and unbroken layer. The light seemed to flux in between phosphorescence and a fluid state, shimmering and waving in equal measures in a surface that the collector was unable to sense through with physical senses alone. In other words, this was essentially a miniature warp gate of its own leading into an entirely different pocket of hyperspace. There's the entrance point, remarked the demon as she squinted her eyes, trying to take in the blue glow of the dungeon from elevated altitude. And from the amount of mana distortion in the area, there's maybe 2 layers. The demon further explained. Dungeons, whether they're bound or unbound, have layers, but unbound ones usually have fewer. I think bound ones had an average of 5 layers. While it's not uncommon to see unbound ones with just 1 layer. Layers. Clarify this term, said the collector. Dungeons are like their own little realms, kind of. Very tiny realms. And inside them, there are layers, each layer being a kind of separate space. All the spaces are completely separate from each other except from transit points that link them together. I see. And presumably, these transit points lead successively down to a central point that determines the greater functioning of this dungeon, said the collector. Yes. Yes, that's right, I think. Usually, bosses are at the bottom, said the demon. And any vessel capable of interfacing with warp travel would also possess a high probability of existing within this central point. The collector clicked its mandibles. 2 layers. 2 gates to travel through. The danger in this dungeon was largely unknown, but the collector could sense that the amount of magical energy fluxing from the dungeon itself was not too threatening. A formidable amount, but none that would indicate a life-threatening presence. And you're right in sensing the dungeon. The quantity of mana coming from a dungeon entrance probably shows how dangerous it is, though there's always exceptions, said the demon. But I don't know much of what those exceptions are. Haven't read that far. The collector made a mental note that the current flux of magical energy and psionic forces before it corresponded to a dungeon with 2 layers. Extrapolating further calculations and points of comparison would allow the collector soon to determine the dimensions of a dungeon accurately soon. The collector clicked its mandibles. It could not always plan ahead nor know truly everything that occurred in the future. The dungeon was a source of many unknowns, but within, its mission lay, and time was sensitive. What separated the collector from more inefficient organisms was its capacity to adapt and react with unparalleled efficiency. It would rely on this trait now as it snaked its body down to face the dungeon, then flapped its wings to send it hurtling down. When the collector neared the layer of fluxing blue mana and psionic energy, it halted its movement, knowing that momentum in movement could be transferred and keeping it was risky when it knew not what kind of environment it would be transported to. The moment the collector hit the layer of blue, its surroundings seamlessly shifted into a completely different scene. It felt a momentary sense of warp travel-based nausea wave over its body before it righted its internal bodily processes. The collector immediately analyzed its surroundings. This area was subterranean, though presumably not deep enough to prevent oxygen flow from circulating. Specifically, the area the collector was in was a massive tunnel stretching far behind and in front of it, presumably linking into a much larger network of tunnels similar to it as well. The dimensions of the tunnel were quite large, easily capable of housing the collector, indicating that creatures of similar size could inhabit the area. The tunnel was not dark. It was lined with lightstones embedded in the tunnel walls that gave off dull, spectral glows of various shades. Aside from that, not notable. The roofs of the tunnels had tinkering signatures on them. Lightstones that jutted out from them noticeably, and unlike those embedded in the walls, these ones were all of a uniform color of blue. Likely, a means to demarcate the tunnels for the inhabitants within. I don't know where to go, said the demon as she looked forwards, then backwards where the tunnel stretched out at both ends. Oh. An ordinary group of humans venturing into this area would have found immediate confusion in determining where to go now, forwards or backwards, but the collector possessed an extreme degree of psionic sensitivity, and it knew immediately the general direction of the nearest mass of psionic tendrils or, in other words, the next transit point. The collector slithered around and went backwards at full speed, wreaths of red mana trailing behind it as its sleek body well suited to roaming the even grounds of these tunnels. Oh. I guess you already know, said the demon as she looked down. Do not waste time and mental resources upon yourself. Focus merely on your surroundings and in assisting my abilities, projected the collector. You're right, said the demon with a decisive nod. It did not take long before the collector noticed anomalies. As it rushed through the tunnel, knowing exactly which paths to take when they branched, it could sense that there were traps inlaid throughout this area. Pressure-sensitive stones to trigger traps, burrowed insects, none worth consuming, and so on, but though the collector did avoid them in precaution, it noted that they did not seem interested in activating against it. Likely because the collector possessed the Thrall's core. This isolated shard of hyperspace recognized the collector as a part of it as a warper and therefore did not act against it. There were also no inhabitants other than the insects locked in a burrowed stasis, meaning there was no real challenge against the collector. This reprieve did not last long, however. When the collector after 10 minutes sensed it neared the first transit point, the lightstones lighting the tunnels shut down, their light fading away. The collector clicked its mandibles but did not stop. Something was manually manipulating the layer's functionings. Likely, the Goblin Lord. As if to confirm the collector's thoughts, it sensed the ground rumbling as it slithered down into a hole leading into another tunnel, this one angling steeply downwards. The hole above the collector closed up with a sudden emergence of packed earth. The collector's sensitive hair stood on end as it sensed an enormous presence barreling towards it. Judging by the relatively monotonous locomotion, not a living being. A rolling object. It looked backwards to see a massive boulder almost filling up the whole tunnel nearing it, using the steep angle to gain momentum to try and crush the collector. "Should I use Sapia?" said the demon as her eyes widened at the rapidly approaching stone. "No, Sapia utilizes mana at a degree several times the expenditure caused from physical augmentation. I will deal with this," said the collector. Red bands of mana coiled around the collector's arms as it stood upright, digging its tail into the dirt like an anchor. A dozen meters before the boulder even touched the collector, it began to punch into the air in front of it. Bone binding drew out or placed power in the bones. In the case of the user itself, bone binding could be used to generate specific magical effects at the cost of straining their bones with excessive usage. In the thrall's case, this was the mist form ability. In the collector's case, this was raw, destructive shockwave force. As the collector's fist shot out in front of it like machine gunfire, blasts of condensed, fist-shaped waves of energy surged out, slamming into the boulder. Fist-shaped indentations cracked into the surface of the boulder, slowing the boulder down and breaking apart its structural integrity at key weak points until finally, when it neared the collector's striking range, one single direct punch into the center of its mass both stopped and shattered the oversized rock. The collector clicked its mandibles as it saw steaming heat rise from its knuckles. "Now there is resistance. But I welcome it. I can sense that it is possible for you, the specimen known as a goblin lord, to perceive my location from wherever you hide. If it is such that you may perceive my words, too, then know that in cowering away, your death will not be painless, nor shall you find honor within the collective." Chapter 68, First Layer. The collector sped through the winding maze of tunnels, moving so quickly that even when it did trigger burrowed insects to arise to the surface, by the time they had unburrowed, the collector was too far ahead of them to catch up. Its movement snaked along the whole breadth of the tunnel, its serpentine body maintaining enough speed to move on the ceilings or sides to avoid traps when needed. Eventually, the goblin lord adapted, unburrowing huge hordes of insects in advance. Some of these, the smaller and weaker ones, the collector could completely brute force its way through by putting its armored shoulder forwards like a battering ram and then activating instantaneous high-speed movement with its mana, smashing through entire crowds and leaving a trail of flying legs and innards in its wake. But as the collector went deeper, the insects became larger. Giant insects of various kinds almost on par with the assassin bug brute, but at the collector's current metamorphosis level, even those specimens were of little worth. These, the collector just evaded, outmaneuvering them by sliding across the ceiling or snaking past them with quick movement. Better not to waste mana at this point for specimen that had no genetic specialties aside from merely being overgrown. 15 minutes of further travel yielded the next notable obstacle. The collector stopped in front of a massive set of double stone doors fused together at the center with a thin line of glowing blue magic. Connecting and locking the doors shut was an elaborately shaped keyhole. The collector clicked its mandibles. Sensing the durability of the stone doors indicated it was a mana-infused structure of exceptional durability, easily capable of withstanding several barrages from the collector without breaking apart. Highly resistant to magical manipulation as well, such as Sapia, due to the strong flow of mana shutting out external interference. Inefficient to waste time brute forcing it. This, said the demon as her tiny form floated in front of it, scrutinizing the keyhole. I don't sense any mana scanning features. It won't check for a magical signature. We just need something shaped like the key. The collector clicked its mandibles, nearing its head to the keyhole. Its 6 eyes analyzed the shape of the keyhole, then it tapped a finger to the edges of the keyhole, allowing its sensitive hairs to feel the vibrations echoing within. Analyzing shape, structure, patterns. Analysis concluded. The collector pointed both arms to the ground, and they flashed purple. A chunk of rock emerged outlined in the same purple, and the collector went to work. The rock broke apart at the edges, forming quickly into a mold that first approximated the shape of the hypothetical key, and then chipped away in fine-tuned detail, carving itself into the exact dimensions of the object to pinpoint accuracy. "Wow," said the demon as she stared at the key. It looks so nice, too. I didn't know you were an artist as well. Evolution is artistry at its highest form, And this mind and body have been shaped by the collective, herald of the ultimate evolutionary process. All that I do is akin to what you tinkerers perceive as art. The collector willed the key into the keyhole, and then turned it. With a heavy, rumbling click, the key slotted in, and the stone doors began to open slowly, the two slabs of rock drawing backwards with the same magical energy that kept them there. The collector squeezed itself through when the gap was large enough and found itself inside a much wider space. An entire cavern that must have been approximately 150 meters in diameter. There was plenty of lighting here coming from large lightstone formations on the ceiling, and the lighting here was not turned off. Water gurgled from a sizable basin at the end, a small waterfall from the ceiling gurgling into it and filling it up. Racks of black and blue weapons, Balkanite and Everfrost respectively, stood to the side, as did piles of fruits that dropped down from vine growths overhead. The fruits used to be laid out in large piles, but now they were scattered about, some half-eaten, and the weapons themselves were in disarray, some strewn across the ground as if left in a hurry. An area for the goblins to rest and arm themselves, it seemed. Recently vacated, however. Beside the stream, there stood a swirling mass of glowing blue energy tendrils, the transit point to the next layer. That there were no goblins remaining here indicated that the entire force had been defeated. Most likely by the group of adventurers the collector had dealt with beforehand. Good. The collector would take some samples of the weapons, assess the fruits for special properties, and then move on. The collector slithered forward a few meters, and when it did so, the stone doors behind it closed rapidly with a resounding crash. The lightstone crystals overhead glowed an aggressive red. The collector felt tremors under its feet for a split second before its hairs picked up on movement. It stepped to the side, and a brown spike emerged from where the collector had been. The spike was nearly as tall as the collector and composed of carapace and covered in barbs to prevent removal when it pierced flesh. More movement underneath. The collector sidestepped another spike, then another, and then it pushed off with its tail and hovered in the air with its wings. The spikes did not extend out towards it. The collector clicked its mandibles. So, there were insectoid specimens under the ground that guarded this area, shooting out powerful spines based on movement it detected on the surface. Judging from the size of the spines, these insectoids were of the same class as the assassin bug brute. The collector clicked its mandibles. As it was in the air now, it was impossible for these creatures to touch it. But they were quick, capable of moving even burrowed, an adaptation that would be useful for the collector. The collector focused its senses, honing them with mana, and then landed upon the earth once more. Not a second later, and a spine emerged. The collector sidestepped it and before the spine could withdraw back into the dirt, grabbed it. With a flap of its wings, the collector surged upwards, and with a massive heave of strength, pulled the subterranean insect out of the ground. The insect was a fat, oval-shaped bug with huge pincer-like jaws and holes in its carapace to project spikes from. From the movement of the spines, they seemed to be flexible and could be extended to great lengths and broken off. Notably, the specimen also seemed to possess the means to rapidly rotate itself while closing its jaws to mimic a drill, allowing it to easily move through dirt. The insectoid specimen resisted, 10 slots on its back opening up to try and shoot out spines. The collector flew up and slammed the creature into one of the lightstone crystal formations before it could, skewering it there and killing it. The collector ripped off its 6 legs, consuming them and making sure it devoured enough to gain an accurate genetic sample. Biomass gained plus 10. Biomass level, 260/100ths. Root consumption limited reached. Genetic material gained. Stored genetic material. Black ant. Deer. Black hobgoblin. Human. Lesser oni. Frostborn hobgoblin. Horse. Lesser great centipede. Lesser great beetle. Spitting great beetle. Leafblade insect. Frostborn hobgoblin thrall. Bineswinger goblin champion core. Flameting salamander. Windcutter wildcat. Shockstripe eel. Shaker fish. Firefly shinchu. Lurker new. Mana level, 330% 360%. However, the collector did not consume the rest of the specimen. Instead, it took out its right hand and made a fist, unsheathing the assassin bug brute proboscis. There were cracks all across the proboscis from the shockwave-based attack the 4-star adventurer had inflicted on the collector, but it was still usable because it had been sheathed for that battle, escaping the brunt of the attack unlike the monomolecular claws which had all shattered due to their brittle structure. The collector stabbed the skewered insect with the bug brute venom, expending mana to create its magically enhanced toxins. The lurker swarmed and twitched involuntarily as the venom hijacked its nervous system. Then, the collector's bill raised in the air, hovering over the bug as it began to program the corpse. The other insect specimen were too slow to keep up with the collector, nor were they especially useful, and maintaining programming expended mana every second. But these specimens, these lurkers, were far more useful, able to roughly keep up in speed with the collector's travel and also form a secondary, hidden means of attack. I see. With what you put into it, you can use Sapia to control it, even when our Sapia isn't meant for controlling, said the demon. She closed her eyes and raised her bill as well, aiding the collector. The collector clicked its mandibles, finishing the programming in a few seconds. With that complete, the collector detached the lurker from the ceiling and dropped it back into the hole it had been pulled from. There were more lurkers in the area. Probably around 2 more judging from the frequency and angle of spines that emerged to attack the collector. Expectedly, the other lurkers did not attack their companion. A fatal error. In the next moment, the other 2 lurkers emerged up to the surface, their wriggling bodies skewered by spines. The collector stabbed their heads with the bug brute proboscis as well, programming them to follow it and attack any hostile presences moving against it. The 2 lurkers fell to the ground as the spines skewering them withdrew, and the burrowed lurker joined its brethren on the surface. The collector picked up the legless specimen to carry it while the other 2 skittered behind, following the collector. Samples. The collector assessed the fruits by the water basin. Mundane fruits that possessed no special qualities. Above, the vines that produced them also seemed mundane, special only because of the magical energy in the dungeon enhancing them. Consuming them would yield nothing. Instead, it devoured samples of volcanite and everfrost, storing them for later in its metalloglottic ossifier. New metalloglottic ossifier samples obtained. Minus lightstone. Minus runewood. Minus bone binding skull. Minus volcanite new. Minus everfrost new. With these samples procured, the collector moved on, heading to the transit point and the second layer. Chapter 69, Inefficient Charge. Touching the transit point immediately shifted the collector to what was presumably the next layer. The psionic signature of the warp gate was much nearer now. Good. An indication that the collector was on the correct path. It assessed its surroundings. The sites of tinkering were strong here. The ground on the tunnel paths were carved out to an even surface shingled with layers of smooth stone that reflected the blue light from lightstones above. Significantly more developed than the prior tunnels. The tunnels themselves were different, shaped in even circles that indicated that they were artificially carved from the earth. There were no presences of insectoids either, and as the collector followed the psionic trail again, it noted that there were not even traps lining these paths. This was a level of development that escaped the grasp of goblin civilization. Stoneworking and the creation of artificial tunnels indicated as much. And, when the collector came upon a small cavern dotted with mattings of cloth that formed beds, it realized this must have been a living quarters for the goblins. Though, with the called goblin populace, this layer of the dungeon became nothing more than a deserted labyrinth. The collector could smell the scent of goblins, however, and they had been here recently. None of them possessed the scent of more developed and stronger kinds. The scents all belonged to smaller goblin or females. No challenges. No sense or signs of a specimen from a higher civilization. The collector exited the cavern, and in short time unopposed by any traps or insectoids, near the second transit point. Slipping down a series of holes through various tunnels led down into a bottom-most cavern far larger than the one housing the first transit point. This area was not developed at all, the ground a cracked, patchy and uneven surface and the cavern ceiling lined with rough stalactites of lightstone crystals. Under their ghostly blue light, the collector first spotted 4 statues fashioned in the shape of a goblin. Yet, different. These goblin visages possessed long tusks and 4 arms. They were also almost as tall as the collector, though whether this was an artistic exaggeration or accurate representation, the collector could not ascertain. The statues stood with swords of stone in their arms, frozen in images of threatening battle stances, and they stood between the collector and double stone door, the same kind as that which housed the first transit point. However, no light of magic reinforced the doors, instead, the light flowed through the statues. The moment the collector analyzed that the magic in this area flowed in concentrated amounts to the statues, the stone goblins moved with clattering and groaning movements. Piles of dust silted in the crevices of their muscles and bodies falling off in small clouds. Natural golems, remarked the demon, a sense of fear tinging her words. Strong ones, too. And because they're natural, they have no cores, they have to be completely destroyed. Can you fight them? The collector clicked its mandibles as it took in the daemon's words. Then it was a waste of time to try and smash and hack these things to pieces. A brief sensing of the golems showed that magical energy flowed through them, empowering their movements, and this too prevented foreign magical manipulation via sapia. Far more efficient to evade them and smash through the stone doors. The collector used dash, zipping past the first two golems, but the third one reacted, charging at the collector at considerable speed and using two of its arms to swipe axes at the collector. The collector swerved back, and the axes crashed into the ground, smashing the stone and lining cracks of impact across them. Considerable strength. Respectable speed. In terms of raw physicals, the golems possessed approximately 65% of the collector's stats while it utilized magic. The collector could easily deal with one by itself. Even 4 at once was an ordeal the collector calculated a 98% chance of succeeding against. But it would prove to be a time-consuming process involving dodging and picking apart at the golems one by one, with more rushed combat greatly reducing success rates. No need to deal with this now, not when the collector was so close to its mission. The psionic threads the collector perceived were strong now, indicating that past the second transit point would lead almost directly on top of the warp gate. The collector powered more mana into its tail and further empowered its muscles, engaging its coil boosters. The tail itself curled around in a spring-like shape, all the muscles stretching and swelling before hypercondensing in an instant, packing as much potential energy as possible. It was then that the lurkers following the collector acted. Spines shot from the ground, piercing through the bodies of the 4 golems and holding them in place. Very briefly, however, as these stone constructs did not possess vitals, and they would easily be able to snap the spines to set themselves free in but a single moment, likely even killing the lurkers by pulling them from the ground as well. For the golems were formidable. In scaling comparison, the 4-starred adventurer would have faced significant difficulty in dealing with them all at once, and he would have made short work of the lurkers if he could reach them. But a single moment was all the collector needed. Its coiled tail unfurled, and the collector shot forwards like a red-wreathed bullet, slipping right past the 3rd golem. The 4th golem could barely react to the collector and lunged with its swords to try and intercept it. The collector swiveled its body and used sapia on itself to change its trajectory and simply evaded it before placing its shoulder forward and slamming into the double stone doors. The stone shattered, the doors crumbling apart in an ear-splitting impact as if a demolitions charge had been set off. Beyond the doors was a narrow tunnel, a corridor almost 50 meters across that led out into the next transit point. The sounds of rock scraping against itself echoed behind as the golems rushed to catch up. The collector slithered through the shattered doors and then put power into its fists. It twisted its body to face to the ceiling and then as it moved, unleashed an unending barrage of rapid-fire punches, using bone binding on its knuckles and forearm to generate further shockwaves that split apart the ceiling, causing the corridor to cave in. The collector leapt out the last stretch of the corridor, sensing with its sensitive hair's adaptation the rapid movement of countless pieces of rubble and debris falling on the golems as they tried to pursue it, trapping them completely. Shrieks and screams assaulted the collector's auditory systems, and it turned to see a horde of goblins before it, all of them packed in front of the portal of the second transit point. Many small goblins and female hobgoblins of red and white shade stood against the collector, shakily wielding weapons of Everfrost and Volcanid against it. Hobgoblin infants lay crying at some of the females' arms, while the smaller goblin infant, young, smaller and more misshapen, gurgled on the floor. The collector briefly analyzed them. 18 female hobgoblins. The rest, the smaller goblins and the infants, did not matter at all. The goblin lord's voice resounded from the portal, echoing across the walls of the cavern. Bold and fight. All of you. The words had a power to them, a magical power, and the crowd of goblin kind stood stronger against the collector, their mouths twisting into snarls where before fear had tainted the majority. Some of the mothers dropped their infants to engage in the fight, and even the infants tried to crawl against the collector, all senses of self-preservation erased with raw hostility. Dominus, said the demon. Magical control of the mind. Although, from what I can tell by hearing it, sensing the flow of magic in it, it only works on goblins. What do we do? Asked the demon. I can see it now. The reason why your Sapia and Stinger did not work before. They were already under Dominus. Then these specimens are useless, said the collector. I will do what is efficient. If you desire to face me, then you will have to kill all of them. All the women and children, said the Goblin Lord, its voice growling, and yet, the collector could sense a strong hint of desperation underneath. Kill all of them, said the collector. That is unnecessary. What? Came the Goblin Lord's voice. The Goblin Lord likely did not believe this would work on the collector. The Goblin Lord had exhausted its options, and when pressured, it would still resort to this method regardless. Such an act spoke volumes of its cowardice. It was no true warrior. Such was the nature of these positions of rulership, these social constructions that created hierarchies among the tinkerers. Unlike the hierarchies of the collective where all served the great purpose with equal devotion, social hierarchies of the tinkerers often bred weak and self-destructive emotions among those they christened with higher titles. Hence, the plague of tyranny that often resurfaced among tinkering kinds regardless of their efforts to stem it. Yet, the collector had found this dungeon in some way an interesting challenge. To be certain, this dungeon was quite well defended. It would have been even more greatly defended had the more combat-capable hobgoblins not been eliminated beforehand. A group of humans, adventurers, presumably, attempting to reach down into these depths would have found countless struggles against them. Clusters of insectoids unburrowing to strike them. Countless pressure-triggered traps. The requirement of a key to access the first transit point. Lurkers guarding the first transit point. Had the hobgoblins been alive, then a veritable army opposing them on the second layer. Powerful golems at the bottom. And now, this, one final attempt to appeal to emotions of compassion. The collector could sense that two of the lurkers had expired trying to hold back the golems, but one of them made its way towards the collector. Soon, it would join the collector in battle. Approximate time for it to reach the collector again, 1 minute and 20 seconds. The collector would utilize this delay to its advantage. The collector put its shoulder forwards again, the spikes in its carapace sticking out, and charged mana into its body and tail. It utilized dash again, shoulder bashing in a straight line through the entire crowd of goblins, killing infants, smaller goblins, females, it did not matter. The force of the charge blew back the goblins that the collector did not directly touch, sending them tripping to the sides or, if they were infants, crushing their fragile forms outright. The collector did not kill all of them. It was inefficient to waste time in eliminating them all when it could simply charge through the ones in its way. It stopped in front of the next transit point, and as a rain of blood, torn flesh, limbs, and skin fell from above from its charge, reached out a hand to touch the portal. The environment around the collector shifted as it entered the third and final layer. Chapter 70, Lost Kingdom. Zol sat atop his throne of carved rock, the crest of his lordship, two tusks stacked atop each other, etched into the smooth rock and studded with lightstone crystals to shine upon a symbol that none knew anymore in this age. The royal robes wrapped around his muscled green skin and mail armor waved as if drawn up by some wind. But here, in the innermost layer of the dungeon, there should not have been any such draft. Winding tendrils of root-like light trickled up from the base of his throne, running up the length of stone and attaching to his body, letting him connect with the dungeon and see the strange monstrosity wreaking havoc upon his realm. Zol felt his fingers grip into the armrests of his throne. This was no true realm. Just a poor shade of what he once had. Once, 1,000 years ago, Boktal stood in this realm that the humans desecrated by naming Terra in their own tongue as if they and the races that joined the common body owned it. Boktal was the kingdom of the goblins, the many-skinned people as they were once known. Its people proudly bore skins that changed shades to suit the diverse weathers of the far-flung reaches in their land, a symbol of their ever-expanding territory that covered frozen wastes, deserts, and forests. Yet now, though the many-skinned people were still called goblins, that term had fallen from noble consideration into a word that evoked disgust and weakness among all. But could Zol truly blame them? Once, there were no bloodlines lesser than the hobgoblins. Now, there were heavily degenerated, dirt-eating, dirt-crawling goblins that were small and insignificant. A degeneration that arose from the extermination of higher goblin bloodlines, forcing them to turn into small creatures that hid in the dark like rats. All this, because Thoktal would not join the common body. Zol gnashed his teeth and lost himself in reminiscence, into the past he still lived in. The goblins had fought with the gods and all other races against the dragons first in the Draconomachy, and then again when the titans arose from the world dungeons in the Titanomachy. But once the gods had established their supremacy, they rewarded the goblins with but one single ultimatum: join the common body or perish. Boktal refused. The king and all 30 lords, Zol included, had been unanimously agreed on maintaining pride in their supremacy. Boctel fell. Zol still remembered hiding in his keep, in this very same throne room, as his forces outside broke against the might of Huara, the great earth goddess. He remembered the sensation of falling as his keep fell into a great fissure in the earth, and then, when the earth closed back around him, the sensation of sleep. A sleep he thought had been the end, but not so. A long slumber. One where he relived the endless cycle of battle and defeat against the goddess. And in the end of that dream, a voice. A gentle, soothing voice. But its message was anything but, kill the humans on Terra. Kill the gods. Zol was more than happy to oblige. Thus, he had awoken. A centerpiece to this small realm, this dungeon, the throne room of his keep still somehow preserved against the movement of space and the passage of time. Thus, he acted on his vengeance. Vengeance that had festered for centuries of nightmares. But how ridiculous it was, thought Zol as he saw the monstrosity moving so easily past the first layer. How ridiculous it was, this whole ordeal. What could Zol do against the might of the gods? Against the common body kingdoms and empires that had had a millennium to gain strength? What could he do when he called upon his kin and found only the most degenerate of bloodlines coming to his aid? Once, he commanded 10,000 strong, now, he could barely muster over 100 goblins to his side, for none even knew of his name. Boctel was gone, erased from history, and all her children scattered among the realms as glorified pests that had lost their culture and ways. What could he do with that? Still, Zol could never let go of his vengeance. It had been etched into him for so very long, and once, there was a time when he had a more level head, but all he wanted to do now was hurt and kill. Terrorize the humans. Burn their civilization down. Because that was what the voice had told him, and he knew not why, but he had to, for he knew at some deep level that if he disobeyed that voice, this second chance at life would be ripped from him. He was a phantom. An ancient relic torn from time by a higher force. At any given moment, that higher force could toss him away and let him rot where he was supposed to. And now, Zol had all his forces wiped out by an adventuring party, and his throne room itself would come under attack against this thing. He would die here without ever even having stepped a foot in a human settlement. Without ever even having killed one human life to pay for the endless misery they and the common body had inflicted upon his own. Should he stop here? Zol's breathing stilled, some measure of his old calm returning to him. There were still women and children of the Hob bloodline still here. They could scatter and renew themselves. The degenerates, he did not care of. Kill the humans. Kill the gods. The voice. Zol's eyes opened up, their red pupils straining as blood vessels flowered out into the whites of his eyes. No, he had to do everything he could to kill them all. And though he did not know if this monstrosity was of the common body, he knew that the demon with it was, and that alone was enough for him to act and use everything he had at his disposal. The women, the children, he would use them all. No matter what it would take, no matter the desperation or cowardice. Zol grabbed his great sword from the side of his throne, his fingers clasping over two tusk shards jutting out from its pommel. At the touch, the hum and glow of blue magical energy arose around the tusks. And when the monster and demon inevitably came here, Zol would fight them too to the last breath. To death and the beyond. ==. The collector found itself warped to a smaller area than before. A single room, not a mass of tunnels and paths like before. Circular in design and 100 meters in diameter. Strong stench of tinkering civilization. An even, tiled stone floor. Walls that rose 30 meters high and carved with visages of crowned goblins. On the ceiling, lightstone crystal formations shaped into a circle with two tusks within emanated light that perfectly emulated the sun. At the center of this room, precisely 50 meters away, a green-skinned, red-eyed goblin stood atop a throne. Behind it, on the other end, a sizable pond swirled with rainbow-colored waters. This, the collector could perceive as the warp gate with every single psionic tether converging their lengths into that single space. "So, you've arrived, monster," said the goblin. The collector briefly analyzed the goblin specimen. Sensing the specimen with mana infused into the collector's ocular systems indicated that the flow of mana in this area swirled around the specimen. This was the singularity point, the boss of this dungeon. Attempting to gauge the amount of mana the goblin could utilize was difficult, for it seemed that so long as it was in this space, by the throne in particular, its magical energy was enhanced and constantly replenished at staggering rates. But the goblin itself was unremarkable physically. roughly of the same size and build as a champion, though less trained as a fighter. There were no signs of physical battle upon its body. No scars. No wearing and tearing. Even the way it breathed and moved was less efficient than the red-skinned goblin champion. In terms of equipment, the goblin did not seem overwhelmingly armed as the 4-star adventurer had been. Rings of metal linked together to form defensive garments lined its chest and legs, and though they hummed with magical energy, they did not possess nearly the same output as the weapons from the 4-star adventurer. A headpiece, a crown, of gold and jewels sat atop its head, but it did not possess any magical signature. Red robes wreathed its body, and these seemed woven more for ceremonial display than combat purpose, but a distinctive lack of heat surrounding them indicated heat-resistant properties of some sort, likely magically enhanced. Would potentially render pyrocatalytic glands less effective. The weapon at its side, a chunk of sharpened metal, a sword almost as large as the goblin itself, possessed a formidable amount of magical energy seething within it comparable to or even exceeding that possessed by the weapons of the 4-star adventurer. "Demonic monster that dares to trespass upon my throne minus," began the goblin. The collector wasted no time before engaging its muscles and blasting off with dash, attempting to disable this creature while it wasted time babbling away. Chapter 71, Goblin Lord Hunt I. This would not be so easy, however. The collector saw as the last moment. Before its fist could smash the goblin lord's head into pieces, its greatsword reacted independently of its owner. The twin tusks at the pommel disintegrated in a flash of blue light, and a shockwave of magical energy sent the collector skidding backwards as it used its tail to stop itself from flying back into the wall. A cloud of blue magical energy arose around the goblin, obscuring visuals, but the collector sensed movement with its sensitive hairs. Something much larger than the goblin lord leapt to the collector, and it could sense its dimensions as being almost exactly equal to the goblin golems from before. The collector swerved its body back, dodging a blow from another 4-armed goblin. This time, the collector could see that this 4-armed specimen was not a construct of stone. It was composed of flesh, blood and muscle. Green skin and red eyes like the lord. Long tusks that jutted out from its mouth. A build almost as large as the collector with comparable, if only slightly inferior muscle mass. It was dressed only in a ragged tunic and loincloth inscribed with letters of a language the collector was unfamiliar with, but none of the fabrics possessed any magical energy signatures. The goblin specimen thus moved only with its own raw physical stats. It looked up at the collector and then charged, blue magical energy wreathing its movements. The collector put up its carapaced arms and blocked a combo of 4 punches. Each punch echoed out huge booms of impact, imparting small cracks into the carapace. The collector lashed out with its tail, sweeping the goblin off its feet before punching straight down, aiming to splatter the specimen's head into the ground. The goblin specimen reacted with expert agility, kicking out its leg into the ground to send it flying back to dodge the collector's punch before flipping in the air to right itself on its feet. The collector halted its punch before it shattered stone and clicked its mandibles as it saw the 4-armed goblin specimen make distance, eyeing the collector. Though not with any real intelligence. Tendrils wriggled from the 4-armed specimen's back. This was under the goblin lord's control, and presumably like the modified champions, enhanced so that it regenerated infinitely provided the lord possessed enough mana, and by the throne, the lord had plenty of the resource. Had the collector not evolved its shock-absorbent Loncane chitinous sublayer for its carapace, there was no doubt that the goblin specimen's blows would have significantly compromised the structural integrity of the collector's carapace. The sub-adaptation reduced those blows to what were moderate bruises, however. Still damage far more notable than any blunt force blows the collector had taken previously. The collector's durability had always been far ahead of its physical stats, allowing it to take risks when it wished to with minimized danger to itself, but never before had it truly required itself to take strong blows. Perhaps this would be the first time. The collector clicked its mandibles in rising desire for battle but stemmed it as it calculated a means to end this battle quickly. Its goal was right there beyond the throne, right in front of it. No more room for error. The goblin lord's raspy laughter echoed through the throne room. That is not all. Come, my twin goblin elites, you who have given up your bodies and entombed yourselves into my blade as my eternal royal guard. The collector watched as the cloud of blue magical energy dispersed as another goblin specimen, an elite as the lord called it, leapt into the air, joining the other one side in facing. The collector. Goblin. Goblin elites. Said the demon in palpable panic. These are legendary monsters. Last recorded being seen maybe 800 years ago. No matter. Age alone does not indicate any evolutionary specialty. I will neutralize these specimens, said the collector. How will you do it? They seem almost as strong as you, said the demon. Do not concern yourself for me. Focus your mental resources on aiding my movements and sapia applications, said the collector. The collector clicked its mandibles as it slithered in circular movement, sizing up the elites as they too sized the collector up. A quick calculation. The stone golems possessed 65% of the collector's combat capability. These elites were stronger for they could properly channel mana through their forms and moved with an efficiency that indicated martial competency. Each one reached up to 85% of the collector's combat capability. Two together would overwhelm the collector over time, though with the collector's efficient processing capacity, they would need to engage the collector in an extended brawl to wear its defense is down. Yet, the collector could not engage in a war of attrition. These elites were likely highly regenerative due to the Lord's powers. Attempting hit-and-run tactics was possible, but risky, for the elites were fast enough to catch up to the collector's higher-end speeds. The Lord did not move from his throne, likely requiring its magical energy to sustain these elites. Outside of this throne room, the Lord likely would never even have been able to unleash these formidable specimens. Perhaps a degenerated version of them. But here, in the heart of his domain, he was strongest. Knowing this information, the collector formulated a strategy. It made note of the exact coordinates of where it had warped into this room. Estimated time of arrival for the one remaining lurker under the collector's control, 1 minute and 20 seconds. Attack, my elites. Bring me their horned demon heads. Shouted the Lord. I will have them adorn my throne as the first to fall to my war. The two elites charged at the collector with extreme speed, their forearms closed and fists ready to pummel the collector. The collector powered mana into its tail and leapt into the air with it, unfurling its wings. The twin elites skidded to a stop, driving up piles of rock as they halted their formidable momentum before they stared up at the collector. Then they reacted. They leapt a dozen meters onto the wall of the throne room, smashing craters with their feet into it as they readied to use the wall as a surface to leap up to the collector. The collector knew they were more than strong and acrobatic enough to reach it. This flight was merely to gain temporary distance. Projectiles, said the collector, processing its intent to the demon. Got it. The collector and the demon flashed purple before shards of lightstone crystal from above broke apart. 6 chunks of crystal rotated around the collector. Spin. Then force push. If I do not maintain this, you shall in my stead, said the collector. This would be highly mana-intensive, but it would expend everything it had to close out this mission. The demon closed her eyes as she powered her own formidable magical energy into the collector. The lightstone crystals rotated in rapid, shining orbit around the collector for a single second. The moment the twin elites leapt off the wall to reach the collector fired the crystals with force push assisted by the demon to the defenseless goblin lord. Mana level, 300%, 270%. The Lord's eyes widened. Both elites flipped in mid-air, ceasing their attack on the collector, and immediately redirecting themselves to the Lord to protect him. A second too late. The 6 crystals smashed into the Lord's direction, but he had managed in the very last nick of time to hide behind his throne, though not fast enough. One of his arms dangled by his side, shredded apart at the elbow by a high-velocity crystal. The Lord growled in pain as he hunched behind the throne. He pointed at an elite. You, guard me. Then a finger to the other elite. You, kill them. The collector clicked its mandibles, seeing the Lord act as it predicted. Maintain a constant barrage. Expend your mana to the very last drop, said the collector. I'll do my best, came the daemon's response with a quick nod. Another series of 6 crystals broke off from the ceiling, rotating once to gain speed around the collector before shooting out to the goblin lord. The elite guarding it was fast and dexterous enough with its broad body and many limbs to guard against them all. But as long as the collector kept up this suppressive fire, one of the elites would permanently be out of commission. The other elite leapt into the wall, then punted off of it to reach the collector. The collector's right arm faced the elite as it soared towards it, and the demon mirrored the collector's movements with her own smaller arm. Mana level, 270%, 250%. Both arms flashed in a synchronized force push. The goblin elite hammered into the ground with a resonating crash, blasting out a humanoid-shaped crater around it. Without even a half-second worth of delay, the elite leapt out from the crater, flipping in the air to right itself on its feet, then leapt back up at the collector. The elite felt no pain, had no free will, and it regenerated all damage, any scars and cuts from the fall smoothing over in an instant. Meanwhile, projectiles constantly rained down from above to the Goblin Lord, and the other elite scrambled to keep defending the Lord as he hunkered down underneath the elite's larger body, holding his great sword above his head as an extra shield as piles of shattered rock and crystal fell all around him. "Maintain suppressive fire," said the collector to the demon as it dealt with the elite. It could feel the daemons ascend through their psionic link. The collector used force push again, but this time, the elite reacted. It performed a maneuver the collector had not seen before. By putting magical energy in a blue sheath around its feet, it created a temporary platform to jump off of, avoiding the linear pushing energy. It twirled in the air, landing on its feet on the ceiling, and then leapt off of that to reach the collector. The collector could easily outmaneuver the elite in the air, however. It flapped its wings down, avoiding the elite's aerial charge, and then reached out with its hands to grab the elite's legs as it soared above it. With a flip of its wings and sepia-boosted movement, the collector rotated rapidly once in the air to generate momentum before slamming the elite straight into the crystal ceiling. Chapter 72. Goblin Lord Hunt 2. Crystals shattered and parted in a rainfall of sunlight-colored shards as the elite crashed into the tusk-shaped crystals. Meanwhile, the demon girl continued to fire projectiles down on the Lord, preventing the other elite from aiding. Her lips quivered and sweat formed at her forehead. Her skin grew even paler. She was straining herself, but the collector calculated she possessed enough mana reserves to hold on. The collector pointed its right hand at the elite and used force push, driving the elite even further and deeper into the ceiling. With a crushing motion of its fingers, the collector finally used both push and pull to compact the crystals surrounding the elite into a ball to imprison and crush it. This would not hold it long, however. The collector calculated that this temporary prison would not last even more than a second. Not enough time for the collector to deal with the elite guarding the Lord below, even when it was distracted against the demon female's constant barrages of projectiles. Not for a lack of combat capacity on the female specimen's part. These projectiles might have been less powerful than the collector's, but they were no less accurate, a testament to the daemon's mastery in perceiving the flow of magic. The collector could sense the lurker's psionic profile close to it now and determined that the lurker was 2 seconds from warping in. The elite would be delayed enough for the collector's method of attack to work. The collector flew down towards the Lord and the elite guarding him, but did not land right on top of them. Instead, it hovered in the air above them with sapient force. At this moment, the crystals above shattered as the imprisoned elite broke free with a burst of strength, ready to leap back down to defend its Lord. The collector opened its maw and engaged the bio-trigger for its pyrocatalytic glands. The trigger clicked into place at the back of its mouth, and a moment later, the reactive chemicals shot forth, scraping against the trigger into a torrent of blue-white flame that washed over the throne, completely enshrouding the elite and Lord in blazing chemical fire. First, an initial attempt to end this battle now. "Assist me in utilizing Sapia to encase the targets within the flames," said the collector to the demon. The demon nodded weakly but bit her lip and roused strength to herself. Her whole body trembled at this point, nearing the limits of her stamina. Both their bodies flashed purple, and then the raging swirl of flames surrounding the Goblin Lord glowed with a purple outline before their chaotic flow came under control, swirling in controlled manner in a spherical formation encased around the Lord and his guarding elite in an attempt to maximize heat exposure, chemical damage, oxygen loss, and, if this did not work, remove visibility and overwhelm the senses. The elite from the ceiling slammed down towards the collector, but the collector predicted the movement and flapped its wings once, sending itself backwards and evading the elite's downward punch. The elite crashed into the ground on a knee, cracking the stone before it aimed itself again at the collector. The sapia sphere containing the flames shattered as the elite guarding the Lord broke it apart with a powerful punch, and the flames escaped outwards, revealing the elite with flames wrapped all around it, flesh melting from it and regenerating together in a continual cycle of destruction and growth. The throne was covered in fire, and though the stone melted, the mana-infused roots in its structure did not decay with the stone. The roots still floated in the air, releasing mana that continued to empower the Lord. As for the Lord himself, he was wrapped up in his cloak, his hunched form coughing. When he exposed his face, it showed severe signs of burning. Blisters, charred flesh, and red eyes blinded from exposure to the flame. But the robes around it had provided just heat resistant enough to allow it to survive. The Lord staggered to a stand behind his elite, his breathing raspy and rattling due to chemical burns, but he was sturdy enough to keep himself alive. Or, rather, as the collector observed with mana-infused ocular systems, the Lord was essentially on life support granted by the remnants of the throne. The mana in the area flowed into him, granting him a moderate regenerative factor. And now, as the elite from the ceiling charged the collector again, there would be no chance to unleash another barrage of flame. But that did not matter. The lurker had entered this layer and burrowed unnoticed due to the flames cutting off the Goblin Lord's vision and senses. This was all the collector needed, and it had precisely timed its flame attack just so that the lurker could enter at the right time. All the collector would have to do now would be to knock down the incoming elite for just 1.55 seconds, the amount of time for the lurker to get into position and finalize the collector's battle plans. The elite sprinted towards the collector, its legs blurring with speed as its forearms cocked back for a series of punches. It would be difficult to quickly disable this elite without also taking a hit, noted the collector. A necessary sacrifice and a calculated risk. A single strike should not severely damage the collector. But what if the hit it had to take did not have to compromise its functions at all? The collector evaded the first 3 punches but delayed itself to get struck by the 4th blow. The 4th punch slammed horizontally right into the collector's face with an initial crack of severe impact. Had the blow been properly applied, the collector calculated it would have faced a 68% chance of near death with concussive force applied to its brain. Yet, the collector had calculated the trajectory and speed of this blow and thought to utilize it to its advantage. The elite had used its full body weight to land that blow, falling for the collector's feint and mistakenly believing the collector slow enough to fully strike with a lethal head blow. This in turn left the elite wide open to a counter. The collector utilized the technique the 4-star adventurer used to disperse shockwaves from his body but modified it with its processing power. In applying that technique to a smaller and more focused scale, the collector essentially diverted the impact of the blow to its face. Approximately 70% of the damage was mitigated, and the punch's formidable force, instead of hammering right into the collector's face and damaging its brain, flowed freely throughout its entire body without harming it. Instead, the collector simply followed the currents of this powerful force traveling across its body, spinning around rapidly in a complete 180-degree arc and smashing the elite's skull with a powerful backhand that was essentially comprised of the force of the elite's own hit with the collector's strength added onto it. A perfect counter, essentially. A counter that started the very moment the hostile party's own strike ended without a single fraction of a second's worth of delay. The collector did not know it, but had any trained martial artist witnessed its movements, they would have most certainly marveled at an almost perfect performance of a heavenly technique known as the returning wind, the performance of which would have granted any normal humanoid more than enough recognition to start their own school of martial arts. The elite's skull caved in with a deep fist imprint as it flew back almost a dozen meters in the air, landing flat on its back as a limp mess while its mangled brain scrambled to regenerate, pieces of skull and pulped pink brain matter growing back. The regeneration was quick, however, fast enough that the collector would not have enough time to reach the Lord and deal with the elite guarding it. But the collector did not need to. All it needed was time for this. It leapt into the air unopposed, preemptively getting a head start. The Lord's blinded eyes went wide as it coughed up blood. A lurker's spine protruded from its chest, skewering its heart out of its body. That heart, the core, was what interfaced with this dungeon, and it would now be the collector's. The spine rapidly extended outwards into the air towards the collector's general direction. The elite guarding the Lord jumped to try and retrieve the heart, but it could not beat the collector's head start. The collector met the extended spine in the air, opened its maw, and gobbled up the Lord's heart. Had either elite not been disabled, one of them would have certainly intercepted it. But now, the collector watched as the elites crumbled away into dust in a sudden instant, twin clouds of ash flowing back into the Lord's greatsword and building back up into the 2 tusks decorating its pommel. The collector reveled in its victory as it landed beside the burning and melting throne. The magical energy swirling around the broken symbol of authority flowed into the collector, restoring its wounds and recognizing it as the new boss of this lair. Chapter 73, Spoils of War. The collector stepped across the burning throne to the Goblin Lord's corpse. The once mighty and proud Lord was on his knees, his figure hunched over as blood streamed from a hole in his heartless chest. His crown fell from his head as he slumped over further, clattering onto the stone floor before stopping by the flame-wreathed throne. The crown flickered and melted, the soft gold bubbling as it slowly oozed into a viscous liquid state. The crown, a symbol of authority vested onto the lord by his fellow tinkerers, and yet, at its base state, was it not no more than a mere decoration? An accessory fashioned from minerals and alloys that held no inherent worth to it. Something gaudy that purported hollow strength. Much like the lord himself. The collector clicked its mandibles as it began to tear the lord's corpse apart, devouring it. Biomass gained plus 30. Biomass level, 291 hundredths. Spirit roots consumed. Root consumption limited reached. Genetic material gained. Stored genetic material. Black ant. Deer. Black hobgoblin. Human. Lesser oni. Frostborn hobgoblin. Horse. Lesser great centipede. Lesser great beetle. Spitting great beetle. Leafblade insect. Frostborn hobgoblin thrall. Vineswinger goblin champion core. Flameting salamander. Windcutter wildcat. Shockstripe eel. Shaker fish. Firefly shinchu. Lurker. Goblin lord core new. Mana level, 120% 180%. Metalloglottic ossifier samples obtained max. Minus lightstone. Minus runewood. Minus bone binding skull. Minus volcanite. Minus everfrost. Minus threefold iron scrapped. Minus ermine robe scrapped. The collector also consumed with the goblin lord the ores and robes that it wore. The ore was called threefold iron, it seemed, and here, the collector recognized a new functioning of its evolutionary system. Beforehand, the evolutionary system had classified organic material into categories based on their general bodily structures, and through these, the collector could sift through and recognize them. However, it did not truly know what these creatures were called by the native denizens of this world. After its sudden metamorphosis that developed its magical capabilities, the collector could begin to understand the information in a context more relevant to this world, allowing it to know the names of whatever it devoured. Curiously, this seemed to extend even to metal alloys, granting the collector enough information to hypothesize that the iron ring weave the Lord wore operated on a tier system. Now that the collector had consumed the iron, it could initiate a more thorough analysis of the material. Its structure had been folded 3 times as its name would indicate, and each time, the shattered remnants of a mana crystal had been folded into the ore. This granted the ore a durability far exceeding that of ordinary iron, though at the same time, simply imbuing the iron with raw mana did not change its inherent properties, it merely enhanced them. It seemed that attempting to enhance those properties with ordinary living mana would not yield similar results. In conclusion, the iron was largely useless to the collector. It was significantly less durable than its carapace and far less useful in utility because at its base, it was simply iron. The robes, too, had been comprised of ordinary fiber weave and red dye, only granted its fireproofing through an imbued magical spell that did not carry over into the properties of the fibers themselves. In other words, the collector could not utilize it, nor would it even if it could, considering it already possessed the Goblin Champion's blessing of Mount Oi. This provided a fireproofing ability far beyond the means of the robes. Both samples, the collector therefore purged from its ossifier, for the organ could only hold 5 samples within it for extended periods of time. The fibers and metals broke down into base components that flowed into the collector's bloodstream, dissolving out through its spiracles later. With additional metamorphosis levels, the ossifier would increase its capacity, but this was the collector's limit for now. It would have to cycle through the most useful samples to it. All in all, a disappointing haul from the Goblin Lord's equipment, though certainly its biological and magical traits such as its core and abilities were of note worth. The Lord possessed an Inhura called Higher Calling that allowed it to control goblin kind with his voice and force their evolutionary growth with his touch, but this power was limited only to goblins. The collector did not deem the ability especially useful in a purely combat sense, considering that the average power of the goblin species was so low. Even should the collector encounter an entire commune of goblins, empower them and bend them to its will, they would all be annihilated by an adventurer of 4 stars and above. In extracting information from goblin specimen, however, this was quite useful. The abilities were also notable in the fact that they were potentially the first set of abilities the collector could assume that in some measure could mimic the larger-scale manipulative adaptations of Infestor and Dominator collector strains. And not all the goblins were groveling weaklings. First, the champion, and now, the elites. The collector looked to the side of the throne where the Goblin Lord's greatsword lay on the floor. Its eyes analyzed the twin tusks protruding from its pommel. The elites had been an exceptional challenge. One that the collector had enjoyed to quite some degree. Theoretically, if there was a champion of enough strength and the collector both bent it to its will and forced it to undergo evolution, an elite could be produced. Though the chances of a champion specimen surviving such a process was low. The collector picked up the greatsword by the handle, and in its hands, it looked almost like a normal short sword. The blade was comprised of a black metal that possessed a surface that seemed to constantly ripple like water. Though the metal itself was not notably durable, the collector could sense exceptional capacity for the metal to interact with magical energy. "Wow," said the demon as she floated down to the sword. She stepped to the ground and stopped herself from collapsing due to mounting exhaustion, rubbing her eyes with her hand. "Look at the surface. It looks like murky, black waters. No mistake about it, that's Abyssium. So called because it's mined from the depths of one of the world dungeons. The Abyss. They say that in its murkiest depths, sanity grows just as thin as light and breath. With it, all types of dominus magic grow much stronger." The collector clicked its mandibles in understanding as it finished analyzing the blade. This metal, this Abyssium, would do well as an ossifier sample. The collector used its regrown monomolecular claws to scythe off a chunk of the blade and tossed it into its mouth. New metalloglottic ossifier sample obtained max. Minus lightstone scrapped. Minus runewood. Minus bone binding skull. Minus vulcanite. Minus everfrost. Minus Abyssium. It then beheld the tusks again. This magical energy signature, it was familiar with. The tusks were bone-binding constructs. However, they were of a capacity and quality that drastically exceeded what the hobgoblin thrall's core was capable of. Even the collector could never hope to reach the level of bone-binding utilized to create these tusks, for the collector could make the processes it took from consumed species more efficient, more varied, but it could not truly increase their natural limits by significant margins. Where the thrall's bone binding allowed the storage of one spell into a bone, the bone binding that went into this tusk allowed for an entire living being to be stored within it. This sword. It's old. Very old. It would be considered a rare treasure today, said the demon with a nod, appraising the blade. And it's soulbound, probably to that big goblin lord. I am surprised you can even hold the sword without it just breaking apart. The collector clicked its mandibles. I have consumed the goblin specimen that declared itself a lord. In doing so, I have assimilated its psionic signature and genetic material. These alone should be sufficient to bypass most biological encryption factors. Oh. It's very strange, said the demon as she cocked her head. Almost like you have his soul in you. No, that's not possible. No living being can ever have more than one soul in them. The boundaries of limitations that you set upon the backwards organisms of this world do not apply to me, said the collector as it raised the greatsword to its eyes. It could sense that by flowing in magical energy to the blade, it could activate the tusks. The collector clicked its mandibles. Though the collector possessed a shard of the goblin lord's essence within it, enough to have the dungeon recognize it as a boss to heal its wounds, this connection was incomplete. The collector could not interface with the dungeon to see through it or manipulate it. Likely, it would have to slot in the lord's core or perhaps even go further and take its form for that. This would extend also to the greatsword and the tusks. The elites within the tusks obeyed the lord, but would they obey the collector? Chapter 74, The End. Are you sure? Said the demon, sensing the collector's intent. She stared nervously at the twin tusks, still remembering how powerful the elites were. I have calculated the risk. It is minimal, said the collector. Regardless, the collector desired a sample of one of the elites even now, if only in honor of the formidable showing they had provided against the collector. The risk was also indeed minimal. The collector was nearly fully regenerated due to the effects of the throne, and it could choose to only manifest one elite. Even if one elite went wild against it, the collector could easily dispatch it in a one-on-one duel. Thus, the collector materialized the elite. A single tusk shattered in a cloud of blue as a shock wave of energy burst forth. The elite materialized from this cloud, and its muscle-bound body and blank face stared at the collector with jittery movements, wavering between standing still and immediate hostility. Not complete control. But enough. It seemed that without the lord's direct presence, the elite did not possess the mutation that took the form of tendrils upon its back. Likely, this meant it did not possess any regenerative properties anymore. Any wounds the collector inflicted upon the elite specimen would remain permanent unless it assumed the Lord's form and core. The collector desired to preserve the specimen to large degree, for the collector intended to consume the tusks whole, entering them as full samples into its ossifier so that it could regrow them in their whole state on its body. Later, when the collector entered its evolutionary cocoon, it would be able to manifest the tusks on its own body, granting it access to two powerful units. Provided, of course, the collector assumed the Lord's core and genes. The collector swiped down with its regrown monomolecular claws at one of the elite's hands, severing it. The elite reacted minimally, though it did inch forwards in a slight sign of heightened aggression. Nevertheless, it did not fully move in a manner capable of inducing harm to the collector. The collector devoured the large hand. Biomass gained +10. Biomass level, 300/100ths. Genetic material obtained. Stored genetic material. Black ant. Deer. Black hobgoblin. Human. Lesser oni. Frostborn hobgoblin. Horse. Lesser great centipede. Lesser great beetle. Spitting great beetle. Leafblade insect. Frostborn hobgoblin thrall. Vineswinger goblin champion core. Flameting salamander. Windcutter wildcat. Shockstripe eel. Shaker fish. Firefly shinchu. Lurker. Goblin lord core. Goblin elite. Curious. The collector noted that the goblin elite did not show up with a core within its system. Organisms that utilized cores actively with triggers and emotions showed up with the core category, and these, the collector had to create entirely new hearts to house. But in specimens that possessed magical abilities that were simply a natural part of them, they did not appear in the core category despite also technically possessing cores of their own. This was due to a difference in how the magical powers in the two specimen types worked. Those under the core category were usually intelligent species and humanoids that actively required the circulation of emotions to channel their cores. The other specimen, however, known among the humanoids as monsters, did not require any trigger to activate their cores to engage their magical powers. Such powers were simply ingrained in them, as part and parcel to them as were their jaws or claws. This type of naturally inherent magic was classified by both the system and the tinkerers as primal magic. Incidentally, specimen that possessed primal magic would also enhance the collector's primal density, whereas core specimen provided no growth to the attribute at all. Thus, attempting to assume the powers of a core was more resource-intensive, for to fully access the full range of their capabilities, the collector had to slot in their cores while it could simply naturally access the primal magic of mystical monsters. This meant that the goblin elite were less tinkerer, less a common humanoid, and far more a monster. Perhaps a quality that had to do with the fact that the elite specimen were of an age far bygone, indicating that the goblin species as a whole had progressively degenerated from natural creatures to tinkerers, weakening their raw strength greatly. Even more of a reason to honor the elites into the collective. The collector cut off the tusks from the greatsword's pommel and devoured them also. Metalloglottic ossifier sample obtained. Minus runewood scrapped. Minus bone binding skull. Minus vulcanite. Minus everfrost. Minus abyssium. Minus burial tusks new. The collector discarded the runewood from its ossifier, for though it could amplify magical energy, the degree of amplification was not impressive, and the durability of the wood left much to be desired. The burial tusks would be far more useful. Perhaps worth an entire adaptation on their own. The collector clicked its mandibles and stretched its muscles, reveling in its spoils of war. It had obtained 5 exceptional genetic templates from the 4-starred adventurer and his weapons. The bone-binding skull would allow the collector a storage space that would only become more and more valuable as time progressed and the collector obtained finer spoils from its victories. It now had useful ossifier samples it could incorporate within itself. The collector, for now, could only manifest small amounts of whatever sample its ossifier stored, making it highly impractical for armoring itself. But it only needed to tip its thel in abyssium to vastly enhance the dominus-type magical influence the collector could project. And then these burial tusks. Already, the elites within them, should the collector decide to assume the Goblin Lord's core to control them, would provide exceptional combat units to assist the collector. In terms of raw physical stats, it would be like 3 copies of the collector bearing down on an enemy. Regardless of the threats the collector would face in the future, it possessed now a multitude of capabilities to deal with them. The demon female specimen slumped down to the floor, her shaky legs giving out under her. She stared down at her trembling legs with almost wondering eyes. I'm so sorry I can't keep up, she said. She blinked hard, It was evident that the inefficiencies of her backwards evolutionary form had taken their toll on her, though this also due to the fact her musculature had largely atrophied from extended periods of time under restricted movement and malnourishment. She had compensated for the deterioration of her physical abilities due to increasing hunger, thirst, and muscular fatigue through sapia. But now that she had exhausted through her mana reserves, the full brunt of both mental and physical exhaustion assailed her. Her mana reserves were formidable ones, certainly, but not easily replenished like the collector's own, and it would take her much time and rest to build herself back up to relatively efficient operating capacity. The collector weighed whether she would prove to be a continued useful asset. She certainly was a wellspring of knowledge that the collector could easily tap into, and she now proved that she was more than capable of applying herself in the throes of battle, greatly assisting the collector's sapia. But these benefits would have to weigh against her physical limitations. The collector would have to provide sustenance for her, warmth and shelter for her in environments she could not handle with the fragility of her form. Her need to slumber would delay or encumber the collector even if it carried her. Yet, thinking of these limitations and the future they would apply to made the collector realize it had, for but a few seconds, put its prime mission to the back of its head. The spoils of its victory had distracted its mind, and the prospect of surviving and growing ever stronger had taken hold of its attention away from the purpose it was created for. Heresy again. And yet, the collector could not deny that this feeling that the demon had called disappointment began to formulate in small measures within the collector. Disappointment that what it had fought for and earned would all be meaningless. No, never meaningless. All of this had been for the grand purpose. The dawning of the collective. From the very beginning. From the moment the collector had entered this atmosphere to fight one of the gods to when it crawled on the dirt as a grub to now, all of it had been for the same purpose. This, the collector assured itself of. The collector clicked its mandibles and moved past the female demon, for if the collector was now successful in contacting the collective, she would no longer matter. There would only be complete assimilation. The demon female specimen looked at the collector as it slithered away, trying to will herself to float to it, but she no longer had the mana nor the physical strength. Instead, she floated for just a second before crashing back onto the ground again, gritting her teeth with heavy breaths. She whimpered as she found herself unable to move and follow the collector. The collector neared the edge of the swirling, rainbow-colored waters. Yes, this was it. A tremendous amount of psionic power emanated from here. Not comparable to a true warp gate but possessing of enough power for the collector to send out a proper signal to the collective. The collector stared at the moving, shimmering water for a split second of hesitation. A second that mattered. All of its sensitive hairs stood on end as the collector felt an intense, almost oppressively heavy presence approaching. A magical presence. A crackling sound echoed from the other end of the room, indicating another being had warped in, and as it did so, this presence only intensified. Never before had the collector ever felt its survival instincts calling to it so strongly. Chapter 75. Ix. An immediate infusion of light radiated throughout the throne room. Brilliant light that shone magnitudes brighter than the artificial sunlight produced from the lightstone crystals above. All that light that was bespeckled with glittering speckles of gold, centralized like a mandorla around a single, humanoid figure. The collector did not even have time to turn to this figure's direction, and when it barely began to perceive the humanoid's form, the specimen was already upon the collector. In a blinding flash of gold-infused light, the specimen crossed the 100 meters from one end of the throne room to where the collector was in the span of a single instant. The specimen's long, lanky punched forearm deep into the collector's back, punching straight through the hyperalloy carapace, long cane chitinous sublayer, and ultrafiber muscle all as if there had been no resistance at all. The collector registered severe damage. Not damage targeted to its vitals, however, as if the humanoid was intentionally keeping the collector alive. This close, with the humanoid's arm sunk into the collector, it could clearly perceive its physical attributes, as well as an intensive aura of heat and the crushing weight of concentrated mana. The humanoid was almost half the size of the collector but still managed to raise the collector up with one arm like it was weightless. 185 centimeters tall. Leanly muscled build wrapped up in a black bodysuit that extended all the way around the specimen's head before it seemingly fused into a golden mask spiked at the ends in the visage of sunlight rays. The mask completely covered the specimen's face, leaving but the eyes open, and these were not truly human, shining like orbs of sunlight with no visible pupils. A large, loose white mantle with golden feather trimming covered much of the humanoid's shoulders and chest. A waistcloth made of the same pure white material and feathered trimming covered its lower body, and golden, segmented greaves ran up from its feet to its shins. The humanoid possessed a naturally exceptional amount of magical energy, but notably intensive magical energy concentrated around its forearms. Specifically, at the glove-like structure covering them. Golden segments wrapped around its fingers, their tips ending in sharp points like claws. Running from the 5 segments capping its fingers were 5 particularly phosphorescent, thin golden lines that ran up its knuckles through the curve of its black-covered arms and ending as they attached to its ivory-white shoulder pauldrons. The humanoid's aura of magical energy emitted slight circulations of wind pressure around it, lifting up its mantle for a second. On its chest, where its heart was, there was etched the outline of a sun-shaped sigil with 9 points that shone strongly gold against the black of the bodysuit. And in the center of that solar outline, there was the numeral X. "Why do you run, my lovely creature?" said the humanoid. He cocked his head ever so slightly as his eyes landed on the collector's horns. "My dear child of night." The collector twisted its body as much as it could with an arm driven into the center of its back. To reach the humanoid, it dislocated its arm, bending it at unnatural backwards angle to swipe at the humanoid with monomolecular claws. This humanoid was powerful beyond measure. Several dozens of leagues beyond anything the collector had encountered, even the 4-star adventurer and the elites. To the collector's current capacity to sense mana, the humanoid might as well have had immeasurable strength. But monomolecular claws split matter on the atomic level. No amount of durability would resist it. Not even the god the collector had faced. The humanoid swayed his head back, dodging the swipe. The humanoid shook his head once before 4 feathery wings comprised entirely of golden energy materialized to his sides. In the next instant, the humanoid flew up to the ceiling at staggering speeds, slamming the collector into the lightstone crystals above face first with intense impact that generated a shockwave of force. The collector utilized dispersal, getting the general timing of this humanoid's exceptional speed to dissolve the shock of the blow. The collector felt carapace all around its head and chest shatter deeply even through dispersal, but had it not utilized dispersal, it calculated an 88% chance of suffering a near-fatal wound to its brain. "Oh, marvelous. Superb," exclaimed the humanoid as he sensed the collector still living. He swiveled to the side, tossing the collector into the ground, far from the pond of hyperspace waters. The collector shot downwards like a meteorite, and it braced for impact, using dispersal again as it gouged out an enormous crater into the ground, large chunks of shattered stone flying off from it from the impact. The collector felt damage rack the entirety of its body. Utilizing dispersal was more difficult against this humanoid for he possessed enormous physical stats that far outstripped the collector. Dispersal required perfect timing, and though the collector possessed vast processing capabilities, approximating the humanoid's speed and strength was still challenging. The collector could still mitigate a vast majority of damage from an impact, but if the timing was even slightly more off and the dispersal incomplete, then transferring shockwaves of strong impact throughout the body imperfectly could cause severe internal damage. And dispersal was the direct opposite of guard, which concentrated defensive mana, meaning the collector could not utilize both at once. Guard was easier to use, more straightforward as a defense, but had less potential to mitigate as much damage. And here, if the collector did not take the risk to use dispersal, it calculated a 99% chance of having died already. Guard would not nearly have been enough to fend against the humanoid's overwhelming raw stats. To think there would be another beautiful little night child here. To think I may bring the salvation of the sun to not 1, but 2 shadow crawlers. The humanoid shouted to the ceiling, his arms raised up as if in praise. With a jarring switch in gear, the humanoid became calm again, dropping his arms to his side. He floated slowly down, pointing his masked gaze to the female demon specimen. "But do not be jealous, my dear, for know that it is you that I have been searching for," said the humanoid as he neared the female demon. The collector stood to a knee, taking in breaths and circulating a flow of mana around its body to compensate for damage accrued to its muscles and bones while the humanoid distracted himself with the demon. The demon specimen tried her best to crawl away from the humanoid with one arm and severe fatigue. She stared up at the shining humanoid with complete and abject fear, but there was not just fear there was recognition. "You remember me, my lovely child, you do." The humanoid grew excited with a shiver, and then in a split second almost teleported right atop the demon, putting a grieved foot down on her stomach and pinning her to the hard floor. The female demon squirmed as the foot, almost as large as her entire, small child's waist, pressed down and slowly crushed her. All those nights we spent together, oh, I remember them so fondly. You must too, I know. I treated you with so much love, more love than any other wayward night child. You must remember it, no. How I etched my love deeply into you, said the humanoid as he ran a hand across his chest slowly as if in ecstatic remembrance. The female demon shuddered and squirmed again. The collector assessed the situation while the humanoid distracted himself. The humanoid was not operating to his maximum combat capacity. To what degree the humanoid restrained itself, the collector could not accurately determine, for the humanoid was simply that far above the collector. But there was one thing the collector knew: it had witnessed this type of magical energy before. From the very beginning. When it had fought the enormous being of light on this world's atmosphere. The magical energy signatures were not exactly the same, but they approximated similar enough frequencies that the correlation was unmistakable. Of course, compared to that being of light, this humanoid was nothing. Infinitely weaker. But to the collector now, he was leagues more powerful. A nigh unbeatable enemy. Was this the higher end of strength upon this world? The collector had not banked on encountering such a powerful foe this early on in its conquest. It had calculated and determined from the amount of resistance it was facing that it was yet to have been discovered on a large scale. Its assessment of the world had determined that this planet's defenses were not yet wary of the collector. And, judging from the humanoid's reaction, they still did not truly know of the collector's presence. No, the humanoid was only after the female demon specimen, but what was she that she merited such an extreme and formidable response? There was no point in conjecture. The collector geared its mental processes to the fight. To its mission. The collector knew it could not win in any engagement against this humanoid aside from infinitesimally improbable outcomes. It had already suffered enough damage to compromise its combat capability to 64%. All 6 of its recently regrown Araka legs were completely shattered. Its wings were severely damaged, making flight untenable. But all the collector had to do was reach the hyperspace waters and interface with it to fulfill its mission. Contact the collective. Initiate a dawning. With the force of 1,000 collectors bearing down on this planet, nothing would survive. This humanoid's incessant rambling would turn to screams in quick order. And all that required a simple touch, one single moment. The collector took one of its monomolecular claws and snapped it from the base. While the humanoid distracted himself with the demon, the collector discreetly used its still barely functional spinneret to attach a thin tether of silk to the claw's shattered base. The collector slithered upright, eyeing first the humanoid who stood directly in the way of the collector and the hyperspace waters, and then to the hyperspace waters, assessing a potential means to escape this predicament. Chapter 76, The Taste of Love. The shining humanoid continued to exercise his strength over the female demon specimen. Oh, someone else has shown you their love, said the humanoid as he hunched over, inspecting the demon specimen's handless arm. She gasped breathlessly as the humanoid pressed his weight down on her chest, spit starting to drool from her forcibly opened, tongueless mouth. With a gentle, caring touch completely in contrast with the brutal force he put on her chest, he stroked her clear forehead. And you have lost your brand. The mark that was proof of your salvation from the ignoble darkness. You were broken and worthless as all your kind are, but with my love and with that mark, you regained some of your dignity. Why did you throw it away? Oh, my dear, why? The humanoid shook his head several times with deep, exaggerated sways. His masked face settled upon the stump of her handless arm. I will break you down and make you whole again, I promise you with all my heart and love. He pointed a golden claw-tipped finger at the demon female's arm, and then with a swift flick of his finger, completely severed the arm at the shoulder with a clean cut. The collector's sensitive ocular systems could perceive that a faint thread of gold had unspooled from the humanoid's finger in an instant, and this thread was sharp and quick enough to immediately sever a limb while also being covered in an intensive field of heat that instantly cauterized the demon's wound. Flesh sizzled and burned as the demon could only widen her eyes at the sudden pain while the humanoid's foot was still pressed into her stomach, stopping her tongueless mouth from even gasping. The humanoid flicked his finger up, and the golden thread tied around the severed arm and brought it to his face. It seemed the thread could move independently from how the humanoid's fingers actually manipulated it. The humanoid grasped the arm in his hand and then with his other hand, carefully raised only the most lower edge of his mask, baring his mouth. But from even this small display of facial features, much was notable. His skin was pale and scarred beyond measure to the point where discolored, Warped scar tissue was the majority and normal smooth skin a rarity. His lips were cracked and twisted in odd angles from burns and scars, and his teeth were sharp, far sharper than any ordinary humanoid's. Looking much more like those of a canid beast's, he brought the stump of the arm to his mouth and bit down on it, his teeth crunching through flesh and bone with ease. "Ah!" exclaimed the humanoid in highly audible ecstasy as he chewed and sloshed the flesh and broken down bone between his cheeks before swallowing it with a large, exaggerated gulp. His tongue, an unnaturally long sliver of deeply red flesh dotted with aberrant, tumorous growths, swept along his lips and chin, lapping up blood. The taste of a night child. The taste of evil. How I longed for it so. And you, my dear, have the most wondrous taste of them all. Among all your kind that I have split apart and sampled, you, oh, none have ever matched your taste. The humanoid chomped down on the arm, speaking in gurgles between ravenous mouthfuls as saliva and blood drooled down from his chin. You are pathetically worthless, all your kind are, for they were born without light to cause nothing but misery and evil. But among the paladins of Judica, among even the 9 race, I alone truly know the taste of evil. No, those fools curse me behind their backs for my ways, I know it, but they are ignorant. They too believe your kind, my lovely night child, are worthless. And I once was in great agreement until I became warden, and after all those years branding and tearing apart, I came to know that your kind are not bereft of value. You are worthless were it not for your taste and how wondrously seductive it is. Taste that they do not know and would never even begin to think of sampling. All they do is turn their noses up and close their hearts and kill and burn. But it is not hate that brings forth your taste. Hate drives the simpletons to kill your kind and simply be done with it. No, it is slow, passionate love that will truly bring worth to you, to your taste. The humanoid let his foot off the female as he convulsed in shivers of joy. Before the demon could draw even a single breath, the humanoid brought his foot down again, this time on the demon female's one remaining hand. A grinding crunch resounded through the air as the humanoid ground his foot, crushing the hand into a pulp and squishing it into the stone. Love like this. The demon girl swarmed and shuddered, convulsing on the ground in futile resistance. The humanoid crammed the rest of the arm into his mouth and then stomped on the demon girl's foot now, crushing it into a bloody and bone-shard-filled pulp. Or this. Pain is love, and only in pain does your taste truly come through. The whole lot of you are utterly worthless maggots crawling in the darkness, but in taste, you are exquisite, and it is only this love that brings this taste forth. Hate brings only quick and painless deaths, but where is the worth in that? Death is so cold and so final, why would anyone desire that? No, it is only in eternal pain that you have taste, and it is only in your taste that you have value. The demon girl grew still, her wide eyes starting to flit down as likely shock and blood loss overtook her. Her heavy and erratic breathing grew calmer and quieter. No, do not leave me, my lovely night child, said the humanoid as he put his mask back on and stared down at the female demon with gleaming golden eyes. He stiffened up and grew serious and still with a jarring transition. Though it does not matter much. My jailers are outside this dungeon. They will restore you yet. Come, let us go home, back to where you belong. The humanoid dropped down to a knee and slung the bloody body of the female demon over his shoulder, and in this moment, the collector initiated its own movements. The collector blasted forwards with as much speed as it could muster, engaging its mana into a dash while activating its coil boosters. But it had sustained too much damage, compromising its movement speed by 35%. This delay was enough for the collector to stop 3 meters away from the water's edge, caught again by the humanoid. Not by the humanoid's physical form, however. The collector saw as 5 golden threads bound its upper body, entwining around it in burning lines that sank through its carapace, but not so hot that they melted straight through its body. The heat was being regulated. The 5 threads extended 24 meters from the humanoid's hand, unspooling from his fingertips. Ah! I almost forgot about you. Another night child. You, too, will come with me. I have never seen a night child like you, but perhaps, with my love, you will taste just as exquisite as my dearest here. The humanoid nodded gently down to the demon female's figure. Stay strong, my dear. I will take your friend and soon, we will all be back home. The collector's arms were bound to its side, but its hands were not. It curled up the finger with the Araka thread attached to it. From behind the humanoid, a thread of Araka silk string, grown so thin it was barely visible, pulled taut, reeling back towards the collector. At the end of this string was a monomolecular edge claw, and with Sapia, the collector guided the claw right to the humanoid's head. The humanoid reacted with superb senses. He had been thoroughly distracted in immersing himself in the female daemon's flesh, missing the thin thread, but now he adjusted, immediately thrusting his other arm out to intercept the claw. The claw pierced straight through the humanoid's gauntleted and immensely durable hand, slicing out through the other side of his hand and gaining rapid distance to his head. An aura of gold flashed from the humanoid's head, and as soon as the waves of gold hit the claw, it disintegrated, melting away under heat so intense it turned the brittle material into ash in an instant. The collector knew that there was a strong chance that the humanoid would evade this attack. Thus, while the humanoid distracted himself dealing with the claw, the collector took that time to act. Using Sapia, the collector snapped off another of its brittle claws and levitated it up, slicing off all 5 threads binding it, for in trying to capture the collector alive, these threads had regulated their heat down to levels that would not immediately destroy the claws when it came into contact with them. Now free, the collector reached into the dimensional waters, its hand slipping in and causing darkness to fill up its vision as it began interfacing with the hyperspace-accessible liquid. Chapter 77, Hyperspace. The collector entered into a state of consciousness that was simply that, consciousness. Consciousness in its barest, purest form, the psionic profile. In this state, the collector could perceive in even greater detail the psionic tethers that swirled within the dimensional waters. If there had to be an equivalent to conventional ocular systems, then the collector would have described the experience as being in the center of a whirlpool of rippling, shining rainbow currents, and lining those currents were psionic tethers, bright white, root-like protrusions that floated up, breaching the surface of the waters and connecting to the material world. This space where the collector's psionic profile inhabited independent of its physical body was called a simulacra. A lesser point in hyperspace meant for creating lower-range warp gates. By analyzing a specific psionic tether, the collector could perceive where it led to, and following that would allow for a warp to that very location. But the scope and processing power of these waters, this simulacra, was minute. A brief analysis of the tethers showed that they reached out only to specific points within this world and its realms, though notably, there were only 5 independent realms the collector could sense these tethers linked to. The collector did not require this. It needed to establish a link beyond this world, to the far-flung reaches of space where the collective awaited its call. Like all collector units, the collector possessed a dawning protocol imbued in its psionic profile specifically for this purpose. Psionic power was based off the mind's ability to interact with space and time. If a sufficiently intelligent life form conceptualized their star, then though their physical forms remained anchored to their terrestrial space, their minds, their psionic profiles, had crossed light years to perceive that solar body. This conceptualization was not merely an image constructed from neurochemical reactions within a processing organ. No, there was something inherent within it that was beyond that, beyond even flesh, and this power, psionics as it was labeled, possessed an origin that eluded even the collective. Of course, unless in extremely rare cases, biological life forms did not possess the processing power to have their minds, their latent psionic energy, manifest any tangible phenomena. Even in the cases they did, it was in minor manipulations of space. Pushing and pulling. Infiltrating other psionic profiles. Nothing nearing the level of warp travel. Yet with warp-sensitive points that led into simulacra, minor holes in space whose ripples reached far around them, it was possible for a sufficiently advanced psionic profile to envision a space, and then connect with the simulacra to manifest access to that place so long as the simulacra's ripples encompassed the area. In this case, this simulacra reached only to specific points in this world. But the collective was perhaps the only life form in the universe that understood the simulacra, hyperspace, and psionic power to such a degree that it could access further into the simulacra and utilize it as a jumping point to reach deeper into the ultimate hyperspace nexus, the tesseract. All simulacra were simply subpoints of the tesseract, byproducts of its greater spatial ripples. Within the hyperspatial, extradimensional tesseract whose great ripples encompassed the entire known universe, it was possible in theory to reach any point in conceivable space, potentially even beyond it to a great beyond past the known reaches of the universe. Thus, the collective believed psionic power and the tesseract the greatest means to avoid the inevitable decay of the universe, though as of now, even the collective's enormous processing power could only grasp the smallest percentage of the tesseract. Yet, the collector, though it was simply a shard of the collective, had programmed within its psionic profile a specific protocol, the dawning protocol, that allowed it to manifest a specific psionic programming from that allowed it to access the Tesseract when it entered any simulacra such as the one it found itself in now. The collector did not have nearly enough processing power on its own to navigate the Tesseract, but the dawning protocol imbued within its psionic profile provided first a means to interface with any simulacra to reach deep hyperspace and then input exact coordinates to the collective and a means to generate a signal to contact them. The first part of the dawning protocol, the collector exercised now. All the white tendrils in the rainbow waters bent and started to latch onto the collector, and in the next instant, the collector predicted these psionic tethers would essentially catapult the collector's psionic profile into the Tesseract. The rainbow waters faded away in an instant, but what the collector perceived was no Tesseract. The Tesseract was an extra-dimensional space that did not truly have any geometric form completely perceivable to an organic life form, but to the collector's limited psionic profile, it should have manifested in a form of four-dimensional cube. Countless cubes linked within each other in constantly shifting spatial dimensions filled with white lines that represented points in space. But this was entirely different. The collector's psionic profile found itself within an infinitely expansive mass of overlapping circular planes, the outlines of these shifting and rippling planes shaded in bright iridescent rainbow and curled like roots. An entirely foreign hyperspace. One that the collector did not even have the slightest beginning of an understanding in how to navigate. Would the second part of its dawning protocol, the signal to the collective, even work here? What was this space in the first place? Did not the Tesseract encompass the entirety of the known universe? The collector could not comprehend this, and its perception of this hyperspace was extremely hazy, the seemingly infinite series of constantly overlapping circular planes flickering and blurring, making them even more difficult to analyze. The dimensional waters of the dungeon, the simulacra, did not possess adequate processing power to clearly allow the collector to interact with this hyperspace. But beyond this issue lay the fact that this hyperspace was beyond the collector's programming. It was only through the dawning protocol imbued within it that it could navigate the simulacra and hyperspace, allowing it to make decisions that would have taken absolutely no time at all relative to its physical form. Yet, here, in this utterly foreign hyperspace, the dawning protocol would have immediately allowed the collector to pinpoint the collective's coordinates to send a psionic signal to, but here, the collector had to manually navigate this infinitely complex hyperspace. And because the dawning protocol could not assist the collector, it drastically reduced its processing power, which also meant that the collector could no longer guarantee that it was navigating this space in a time span equivalent to a single instant to its physical form. This, during a time where every single second meant the collector's potential death at the hands of the humanoid. Already, in simply beginning to conceptualize this hyperspace, several seconds might have passed to the collector's physical body. Perhaps even more time. It was impossible to tell. It was an improbability of high degree that the collector's physical form remained intact. But it could not continue to push these boundaries of probability much longer. The collector had to make a decision now. "Oh, my dear, my love, what has your new friend done?" exclaimed the warden as he stared down at his hand. 5 golden severed threads spooled back into his gloves, and his flashing gold eyes flickered as he hung his head low. "My dearest Ambrosian arms severed like this? Why, that is a sin that even I, with my boundless love for your filthy kind, cannot forgive." A pause. "Krilla, my dear," said the warden as he switched his gaze, eyeing the demon child staring listlessly up to the shining cavern ceiling. "You have a name. So must your friend. Tell me, what is it?" Krilla's tongueless mouth gaped open like that of a beached fish's as her vision blurred and focused in erratic intervals, focusing only on the lightstone crystals above at their hazy sunny light. "You must tell me," said the warden. "I love your kind, I do. That is why when I have finished tasting any one of you, I always remember your names, etch them into my heart with the great flavor they give me. I need to know this one's name before he dies." Krilla could barely hear the warden's words. They drifted into her ears as if in slow motion, garbled like they had traveled through water to reach her. "Ah, right, I tore out your simple tongue long ago," said the warden with a nonchalant, remembering shrug. "And I suppose you are too tired of being loved to speak to me in any case." The warden looked over to the strange new demon, one unlike he had ever seen before, but in the end, that did not matter. All of them were his too. Be loved no matter what. No matter how small or big. Old or young. Even infants that could barely crawl possessed quite the exquisite taste. It was an awful tragedy that he would only be able to taste this night child raw, without love marinating its flesh, but alas, Even he and his boundless love could not forgive anyone from harming his Ambrosian arms. The daemon's large figure was hunched over the dimensional waters of the dungeon. The warden had feared that perhaps it might have warped out, but it instead strangely remained frozen. "I will ask him personally," said the warden as he floated over to the new demon, his 4 golden wings of energy shining by his sides.